During the most challenging time of World War II, which was the 1940s, a group of Russian scientists were tasked with the responsibility of tackling a particular problem that was very pressing. The objective was to design a plan that would enable them to maintain the alertness of their men and keep them engaged in warfare for lengthy periods of time. When it came to the demands of the war, fatigue was just as deadly of a foe as any other enemy that might be found on the battlefield of the conflict. Accordingly, they devised a plan for conducting an experiment. A study that was carried out on human subjects with the intention of determining the absolute maximum amount of sleep deprivation that may be tolerated. The objective of this experiment was to ascertain what would occur to the human mind and body in the event that sleep was completely removed from the equation. They required subjects to work with in order to accomplish this. They were able to find the 5 individuals when they were disguised as prisoners of war throughout their search. In light of the fact that these people were likely to face a challenging future, the arrangement that the scientists offered them seemed like a miracle to them. They were informed that they would be subjected to an experimental gas that would prevent them from sleeping for a period of 30 days during the period immediately after the exposure. In the event that they were able to survive the entire 30 days, they would be released from their confinement under the terms of their freedom. As a result of the fact that they had everything to gain, men who had nothing to lose and everything to gain were unable to refuse this offer because they had everything to gain. There is a good chance that when they gave their agreement, they were anticipating a difficult but ultimately manageable struggle that would conclude in them being released as free men. The investigation was carried out inside of a gas chamber that was completely sealed off from the outside world. It had the ability to provide for itself despite the fact that it was quite small. In the interior, there were cots for the 5 guys, a basic bathroom, flowing water, and enough dry food to sustain them for well over a month. Additionally, there was a simple restroom. To further assist in passing the time, there were also literature available for consideration. Absolutely, without a shadow of a question, the gas was the most essential component. A chemical concoction that the researchers believed would effectively inhibit the need for sleep without generating any bad effects that could be fatal was the stimulant that was being tested in this experiment. The researchers believed that this mixture would be effective. Given the circumstances, it was reasonable for them to think that it would not lead to the deaths of the individuals. In those days, there were limitations placed on the usage of technology. The room was not monitored by any closed-circuit cameras at any point during the day or night. Instead, there were no cameras present. As an alternative, the researchers were compelled to rely on a number of microphones that were strategically placed throughout the room in order to listen in on the participants. They had a single, small, round porthole window that was approximately 5 inches thick. This was done for the purpose of delivering a visual. Utilizing this glass, they were able to observe the chamber from the observation room that they were in. They would be able to see the events that took place through this microscopic window and the crackling microphones during the course of the 17 days that followed. Consequently, the staff members brought the 5 men inside the room where they were being held. After they had left, the heavy steel door was secured tightly behind them, and the locks produced a satisfying clanking sound as they were locked. Immediately after that, the researchers began to introduce the stimulant gas into the room through a pump. The experiment had not yet begun, but it was now officially confirmed. At first glance, it seemed as though everything was going according to plan throughout the first few days of the process. The behavior of the individuals was similar with what one would anticipate from any group of strangers who were all confined in the same location. This was the case despite the fact that the participants were awake. During the process of getting to know one another and sharing stories from their prior lives, they participated in idle discussion with one another. There was a sense of cautious optimism that could be heard in their words, as they were of the same opinion that they would be able to make it through this together and obtain the freedom that had been promised to them. Not only did the researchers observe, but they also listened and took notes on what they came across. A gas that was operational was present. In the study, every single person was awake. Things are going swimmingly up to this point. The researchers, on the other hand, began to see a discernible change in the way that the conversations were being carried out on the fourth day of the study. After some time had passed, the idle chatter and incessant chit-chat were no longer present. Instead of talking about anything else, the men started talking almost exclusively about incredibly traumatic events that had occurred in their previous lives. The persons who were listening on the other side of the glass were left feeling uneasy as a result of the fact that they brought up the most challenging periods in their lives and spoke about them in a manner that was not emotional and was monotonous. In spite of the fact that it had only been a few days since the room had been filled with optimism, that optimism had completely disappeared. In consequence of this, it was replaced by a growing sense of unhappiness and pessimism regarding the circumstances in which they currently found themselves. As more time passed, she gradually came to the idea that she was unable to sleep and that she was confined to a room because she was stuck there. In the vicinity of the sixth day, there was yet another occurrence that was of immense consequence. All of the subjects stopped speaking with one another, including each and every one of them. Immediately after that, there was a profound and nervous stillness that pervaded the entire room. A group of males who had previously been a loosely organized group had now fully isolated themselves from one another. This was a significant change from the previous situation. One by one, each and every one of them staked their claim to a certain sector of the room, a small space that was only theirs to hold. They were muttering to themselves in a low voice as they were sitting or standing for long periods of time. The researchers paid close attention to the conversations that were being picked up by the microphones in an effort to make sense of the hushed chats that were being picked up. Through a growing sensation of anxiety, they came to the idea that the subjects had been persuaded that they could achieve their freedom by betraying their fellow troops. This realization caused them to feel uneasy. Subjects would approach one of the mics one at a time and begin whispering once they were in close proximity to it. This would happen in a sequential manner. In order to gain favor with the researchers, who they believed were evaluating them, but who were not there, they would concoct elaborate and false tales about the other participants, accusing them of committing a range of wrongdoing. This was done in an effort to win favor with the researchers. They were under the notion that if they were able to just sell out some of the other option choices, then they would be the ones chosen for distribution. In contrast, the researchers did not take any action in response to the situation. Through simple listening and observation, they meticulously documented the psychological degeneration that was taking place. They were not there to make deals, rather, they were there to observe the ramifications of the gas and the lack of sleep. This was done so that they could see the effects of both of these factors. Over the course of 3 more days, this pattern of secrecy and subtle treachery continued to be observed. With the passage of time, the atmosphere inside the chamber got increasingly suffocating and toxic. The strain was clearly beginning to take its toll on their minds, despite the fact that their bodies were still in good shape. It was obvious that their minds were beginning to break down. After then, the experiment took a violent and terrifying turn on the morning of the 10th day, which ultimately led to the conclusion of the experiment. Surprisingly, and without any prior warning, one of the individuals began screaming. There was no prior warning. It was not a brief outpouring of agony or exasperation by any stretch of the imagination. At the same time, it was a shout of pure misery that was full-throated, continuous, and of a primeval character. As he started screaming at the top of his lungs, he started running back and forth across the small chamber. He was becoming increasingly agitated. There was a reverberation of his voice off of the concrete walls. While observing the scene from the viewport, the researchers stared in a state of stunned scrutiny. 3 hours in a row, the guy fled and yelled in an attempt to get away from the situation. When confronted with this outburst, the other four players responded in a manner that was both peculiar and unnerving. There was not a single response from any of them. The man who was yelling did not appear to be real, at least not from the outside. The fact that they did not acknowledge him, that they did not communicate with him, and that they did not make any effort to calm him down was disappointing. They gave off the impression that they were completely oblivious to the fact that they were in a confined space that was rather small and contained a man who was ranting at an extremely high volume. Instead, they made the decision to embark on a peculiar and methodical project that they carried out on their own. Within the books that had been left for them, they started ripping pages out of the volumes as soon as they were placed. The pages were transported to the little bathroom area where they were soaked in water, and then they started plastering them on the interior of the porthole window, which had a thickness of 5 inches. They steadily obscured the researchers' only view into the chamber by covering it with damp papers page after page. This was the only way they could see inside. In spite of the fact that the shrieking continued to fill the room, they worked in a manner that was composed and focused on their goals. After a period of 3 hours, there was an abrupt halt to the screeching that had been going on. Even after the sounds had ceased, the man continued to run in the opposite direction, going back and forth between the two locations. There were just a few faint squeaking noises that the researchers were able to pick up on when they listened via the microphones, despite the fact that they made every effort to do so. Their inquiry led them to the conclusion that the man had yelled so loudly and with such ferocity that he had physically torn his own voice cords to shreds. This was the conclusion that they reached after conducting additional investigations. He could only produce those wretched gasping squeaks, which were the only sounds he could make. After a while, he lost the ability to yell. When his voice eventually gave up, a few of the other subjects had already finished their job. He was the last one to finish. This was the predicament, which involved completely concealing the viewport. Inside the chamber, none of the researchers were able to see what was going on because they were denied access. There was a surprising occurrence that filled the observation box with a new sound, which was silence. Every single one of the yelling had ceased. All of a sudden, there was no longer any whisper at all. It was no longer possible to hear any murmuring. It was completely devoid of everything. Over the course of the succeeding 3 days, the chamber was characterized by an absence of any and all noise whatsoever. After this moment, the researchers were separated from the rest of the population. Not only were they unable to see, but they also lacked the ability to hear something. Their ignorance of the events that were taking place inside was full and utter. As time went on, the scientific team began to experience an increasing sense of terror. Have all of the subjects been left out of the evaluation? Are you of the opinion that there was a problem with the microphones on the stage? The only piece of information they had to work with was a single piece. During the time that they were inside the chamber, they were monitoring the amount of oxygen that was being used up. Furthermore, they were able to deduce on the basis of the data that the gas was still being used at a rate that was comparable to that of 5 individuals who were still alive and breathing at the time. In point of fact, the amounts of oxygen that were consumed were very large, which implies that the subjects were indulging in strenuous physical exercise. Given that they are entirely silent, what might they possibly be doing at this moment? The debate was intense among the group of researchers who were working together. Having endured this unsettling silence for 3 days, I finally reached my breaking point. The decision was reached by them that they needed to take some kind of action. Due to the fact that they were unable to accept the risk of opening the chamber without having any previous information of what was going to take place, they made the decision to make use of the intercom system for the very first time since the experiment had begun. As he came in closer to the microphone, one of the key researchers said something with a strained tone in his voice. He went on to announce to the people in the room that they were going to open the door in order to test the mics. He then proceeded with the announcement. In order to ensure that the persons did not struggle, it was requested that they lie down on the floor in a flat position. He gave them the assurance that they would be rewarded to the extent that they complied. After that, he made an offer that he believed would have the effect of breaking the silence and generating a response from the other party. It was his response that he said, "If you comply, one of you will be granted your immediate freedom." In the moments that followed the proclamation, there was a brief pause that was characterized by static. In the time that they were waiting, the researchers did not let their breath escape. Following that, a voice could be heard emanating from the person who was speaking. Even though there were no clouds in the sky, the atmosphere was utterly terrifying. At first glance, it seemed as though a single person had approached a microphone and articulated their thoughts in a manner that was completely understandable. In his statement, he made the statement that we no longer want to be freed. The researchers were filled with fear and confusion as they confronted one another and looked at each other. During that time period, they were still alive. The microphones were operating as expected. The message, on the other hand, was incomprehensible without exception. What might possibly be the reason that they would no longer want to be let free? I was curious as to what exactly had occurred in that room. The decision was made in the end that the chamber would not be open to the public. The chilly response had caused everything to be different from what it had been before. Ultimately, they came to the conclusion that the experiment should be allowed to continue until it produced the desired outcome. It took 2 more days before the silence returned, and when it did, it was profound and unnerving. There was still a cover that was placed over the porthole. The amount of oxygen that was consumed stayed at a somewhat high level. Finally, at the stroke of midnight on the 16th day, the researchers made the announcement that the experiment had been completed in its entirety. Eliminating the stimulant gas from the chamber was the initial step that needed to be taken in order to complete the task. They began an air pump that brought in clean, fresh air after they had turned off the supply of air. Immediately after the chamber was filled with the fresh air, there was a sudden breach in the silence that happened in the room. It was possible to hear a scream coming from within the limits of the room. For this particular occasion, however, there was more than one subject to talk about. To my ears, it seemed as though there were all of them. This is in addition to the fact that they were not yelling out of wrath or despair. As they got closer, they heard screams of terror and desperation coming from them. The researchers were able to hear them pleading and asking for the gas to be turned back on through the communication link that was provided by the intercom. Someone who sounded like they were totally confident that they were soon to pass away was the one who made the statement. A number of soldiers was called in to break into the chamber and remove the individuals who were being held captive, despite the fact that they begged for their release. When they broke the seal that had been placed on the enormous door, the military was able to open it. Although it had been 5 days since the researchers had last seen the scene inside, they were finally able to catch a glimpse of it as they stood behind them. The situation was an example of something that may have been taken straight from a nightmare. The place was a shambles, a piece of disaster. The floor was covered with a thick coating of bloody water that was approximately 4 inches deep and had grown stagnant. This water had gotten stationary. It was the drain in the middle of the room that had been purposely stopped, and it was the source of the issue that was plaguing the establishment. Regrettably, the 5th subject, the one who had ended up not surviving, had passed away. The appearance of his chest and thighs was such that it seemed as though portions of skin had been removed from them. It was determined by the researchers that these pieces of his own body had been used to plug the drain, which led to the room becoming flooded. This was the cause of the flooding. The 4 participants who had survived were in a terrible condition, despite the fact that they were still alive while the experiment was being conducted. The bones on their bodies were visible through the skin, indicating that they were suffering from severe forms of malnutrition. The most unsettling element of the situation, on the other hand, was the fact that they too had massive pieces of flesh removed from their original bodies. Both blood and a raw appearance could be seen in the wounds. An additional inquiry revealed that these wounds were self-inflicted and that they were not caused by their teeth, but rather by their hands. This was discovered after the study was carried out. Over the course of several hours, they had painstakingly removed sections of their own skin and muscles off their bodies. This was in addition to the fact that they had not been eating the flesh. It had been more than 5 days since anyone had any kind of interaction with the food that had been supplied for them. At first sight, it seemed as though they had completely lost their minds and had begun tearing themselves apart from one another for no apparent reason at all. During the time that the soldiers attempted to enter the chamber and remove the victims from it, the 4 people who had managed to escape fought back with a ferocity that was brutal on the part of the soldiers. While they were yelling and struggling, they were attempting to leave the room as quickly as they could. Furthermore, they did not stop asking with the specialists to turn on the gas supply whenever they made their request. Even though their bodies were famished, they fought with such a strong will, which is a testimonial to their condition. One of the subjects jumped at a soldier while they were engaged in the combat and used his teeth to rip into the soldier's throat. This occurred while they were engaged in the conflict. He was laying on the floor of the chamber, bleeding out, when the soldier passed away. He had been there for some time. In addition, one of the guys was involved in a fight that was so intense that he ruptured his own spleen and passed away as a result of internal bleeding right there in the middle of the commotion. While we were in the process of removing the subjects from the room, we discovered that 2 of them had already passed away. After finally gaining control of the situation, the 3 individuals who were still alive were shackled against their will and immediately sent to a nearby medical institution. They were in a precarious situation, both because of the wounds that they had inflicted on themselves and because of the terrible malnutrition that they were experiencing. It was determined that the individual who had incurred the most severe injuries out of the 3 needed to be taken to an operating room under emergency circumstances. While they were still being held under restraint, the other 2 were being held in a separate room. At the same time as the medical personnel were preparing the first patient for surgery, they attempted to calm him down by administering a standard sedative to him. This was done in an effort to bring about relaxation. Nevertheless, it did not have any effect whatsoever. It appeared as though he was unaffected by the danger. In spite of the fact that they supplied dosage after dosage, which was substantially more than a regular man would be able to tolerate, the situation did not change. While he was still struggling against his ties, he continued to plead for the gas and beg to be kept awake. He was also still struggling against his binding. In the end, the medical professionals arrived at the decision that they had no choice but to administer a general anesthetic in order to have him go through with the treatment. When they told him what they were about to do, he instantly started fighting back with even more intense brutality. He continued to fight until he was completely defeated. There was no desire on his part to undergo the anesthetic. His screams were loud and clear, and he insisted that he had to remain awake. It was during the midst of his frantic battle that he was able to gather an unusual amount of energy, which ultimately led to the breaking of one of these sturdy leather straps that was securing him to the table. It came as a shock to the specialists working in the medical field. During the time that they were delivering the anesthetic, it took a number of them to hold him down and prevent him from moving around. He needed to be given a dose that was more than 10 times larger than the average quantity in order for them to be successful in inducing him to lose consciousness. The moment his eyelids dropped and he started to nod off, his heart stopped beating. This occurred simultaneously. It was after the fact. All of the researchers were completely and utterly shocked. The next item that they discussed was the person who had a tear in his vocal cords. They moved on to the next topic. It was within the confines of the operating room that he was brought. In spite of the fact that he was unable to communicate verbally, he quickly shook his head in a nonchalant fashion upon seeing the anesthesia. In a manner that was identical to that of the first man, he fought with all of his might, flailing and struggling with all of his might. Because of the tremendous amount of effort that he put forth, he eventually gave in to exhaustion and passed out as a result of his exhaustion. His vital indicators remained the same at the time he lost consciousness, just as they had been the case with the previous topic. In addition to that, he has lost his life. In the present moment, there was only one subject that was still available. 2 of the 3 people who had survived had already passed away by the time they were rescued from the chamber, and both of them had passed away the instant they had closed their eyes and gone to sleep. After doing their research, the experts arrived at the conclusion that the symptoms they were experiencing were indeed caused by sleep itself. They came to the conclusion that the most recent survivor would not benefit from doing surgery. They could have decided to come up with a fresh approach as an alternative. After that, they would reset the gas supply and then place him back inside the chamber where he had been previously contained. Given the circumstances, it was quite probable that it was the sole factor that was preventing these men from going away. Before bringing him back into the chamber, it was decided that he would be connected to an electroencephalogram (EEG) machine so that they could monitor the activity of his brainwaves. One of the things that they conducted in the experiment was something that they had not done up until this point in the trial. Following the attachment of the electrodes to his scalp, they proceeded to activate the monitor and initiate the treatment further. At the same time that a green line was following the patterns of his brain activity, the researchers were observing the screen that was presenting the statistic. After then, they became aware of something that was not only odd, but also profoundly unsettling. The line on the electroencephalogram would periodically go entirely flat for a brief period of time, giving the impression that he was completely incapacitated and without any consciousness. Immediately after that, it would immediately resume its regular activity in a manner that was just as abrupt. There was a surge and decline, and then there was a plateau after that. There was a surge and decline, and then there was a plateau after that. During the time when one of these episodes of flatline occurred on the monitor, it just so happened that one of the researchers was looking at the subject himself. He saw the subject's eyelids entirely closed for a brief moment, but it was only for a fraction of a second. It was a brief period of time spent sleeping. He was literally going through a period of brain death each and every time he blinked or his eyes briefly fluttered shut, and this was happening over and over again. He was going through this process over and over again. The researchers were finally made aware of the terrible reality that they had been living with. Because of the combination of the gas and the awful lack of sleep that they had been suffering, their bodies had undergone significant changes. This was the outcome of the combination of the 2 factors. They were no longer responding to it as a therapeutic process. Rather, it was a process that ultimately proved to be fatal for them. After they realized that the final victim was on the verge of experiencing the same fate as the others, they made a frenzied run to get him back inside the chamber and resume the gas. They eventually succeeded in doing so. A furious race against time was taking place in order for them to recover their last piece of data, which was also their last survivor. They were trying to save it no matter what. On the other hand, it was already quite late. As a result of the consequences of the preparations that were being made for the chamber, the body of the victim ultimately succumbed to the effects. He fell into a deep and restful sleep as he drifted off to sleep. As the researchers observed the EEG monitor, they were filled with a spooky sense of wonder. For a limited period of time, the brain waves that are indicative of a significant amount of deep slumber were exhibited on the screen. He had been waiting for a period of more than 15 days before he was finally able to enjoy a night of pure sleep. After a certain point, the line reached a point where it was completely flat. Suddenly, his heart stopped beating. It was after the fact. Every one of the 5 topics had vanished as a direct consequence of this. The disastrous failure of the experiment had resulted in the deaths of a total of 6 individuals, including the soldier. These deaths were a direct consequence of the failed experiment. The researchers were left with a mountain of worrying data at the end of the day, but they did not have any answers that could be considered definitive. In what specific ways did the gas affect them, and how did it affect them? What caused them to go insane and rewire their biology to make resting a potentially dangerous condition? Might it have been the stimulant itself, or might it have been the prolonged and complete lack of sleep that had led them to become insane? There was no way that they would ever be able to provide an answer to the question that was being asked. During a period of extreme desperation, the documents of the experiment were buried, and the story was covered up. This was a terrible secret that was kept hidden from the public. When the unrelenting pursuit of knowledge crosses the boundaries of ethics and enters the murky unknown of the human mind, it serves as a sobering reminder of the potential outcomes that could occur as a consequence of this. I want to express my gratitude for your presence here today. If you watched the program that was broadcast today, I would appreciate it if you could share your ideas with me in the comments area. Also, bear in mind that we have a whole playlist of episodes of True Crime waiting for you to watch in one sitting right now. You may watch all of these episodes in one sitting till the next time we meet again. What's going on? On the morning of the 4th of August, 1998, a 49-year-old woman named Charlotte Waits was rushing around her kitchen in Lynette, Alabama. She reached past her husband, Barry, who was busy washing the last of the breakfast dishes at the sink, and she grabbed a clean coffee mug from the cupboard. It was a Tuesday morning, and just like any other Tuesday, they were both getting ready for what they knew would be busy days at work. Charlotte was a well-respected school administrator for the local district, and Barry was the acting mayor of their small town, a tight-knit community of about 9,000 people where everyone seemed to know everyone else. As Barry dried his hands and left the sink to go grab his briefcase from the dining room table, Charlotte, who was pouring herself a cup of coffee, reminded him about her schedule. She had a hair appointment later that morning, and she also wanted to let him know she'd probably be home later than usual. The reason was she had a difficult meeting with her attorneys that afternoon. You see, Charlotte was unfortunately in the middle of a tense and complicated legal battle. The battle was with her own cousin, a man named Wayne, and it was all over the inheritance from her late uncle's will. The uncle had been quite successful and had left a lot of valuable land directly to Charlotte. But her cousin Wayne believed that he deserved a piece of that land too. So he was formally contesting the will, and today was the day that Charlotte, Wayne, and their respective lawyers were all scheduled to meet and try to hash things out once and for all. Barry turned to Charlotte and asked if she had decided what she was going to say at this meeting. Had she made up her mind about what to do? Charlotte just shook her head and said no, she was still thinking it over. She knew deep down she didn't want to just give up the land her uncle had specifically left to her. But at the same time, she hated the idea of tearing her family apart over money. It just wasn't worth it to her. Barry walked over to where she was standing, and he put a reassuring hand on her shoulder. He told her that whatever happened, no matter what she decided, the family would get through it together. He gave her a quick kiss on the cheek, grabbed his briefcase, and then he left for work. Once Barry was out the door, Charlotte finished her coffee and left the kitchen. She walked up the stairs and knocked gently on the bedroom door of her 17-year-old daughter, Kara. As soon as her knuckles rapped against the wood, Charlotte heard a low groan from inside the room. She opened the door, just a crack, and peered inside. She found Kara curled up in bed, looking very tired and very pale. Charlotte knew this wasn't just a case of a teenager trying to get out of going to school. The reason Kara looked and sounded the way she did was because she was pregnant and she was dealing with some pretty severe morning sickness. Now, to be honest, Charlotte was not at all thrilled about her 17-year-old daughter being pregnant. But what made it even worse for her was that she absolutely could not stand Kara's boyfriend, a young man named Dave Reed. In Charlotte's eyes, Dave was nothing but trouble. He drank too much, he was constantly getting into minor scrapes with the law, and he was just not the kind of person Charlotte wanted her daughter to be with. At one point, before Kara was pregnant, Charlotte and Barry had actually forbidden her from seeing Dave. They had laid down the law and told her, "You cannot date him anymore." But in secret, the two teenagers had continued to see each other. And now, Kara was pregnant. So, Charlotte couldn't help but feel a deep sense of disappointment in her daughter's choices. But she also knew, more than ever, that her daughter was going to need a lot of support from her, not just to finish high school, but also to navigate the challenges of being a teen mom. So, for the time being, Charlotte was just trying to keep the peace. With that in mind, she stepped into the bedroom and softly asked Kara how she was feeling. Kara just kind of shrugged from under the covers and said she was okay, just a little nauseous. Charlotte was sympathetic and nodded. She walked around the room, tidying up a little bit as she spoke. Then she reminded Kara that her older sister, Heather, was coming home from college that night. She said it would be really nice if they could all have dinner together as a family. Kara told her that she did have a babysitting job that would take up most of the day, but she promised she would be home in time for dinner. Charlotte was pleased to hear that. She told Kara she would see her later that night, said goodbye, and then explained that she had to get going to work herself. So Charlotte left the bedroom, went back downstairs, grabbed her purse from the entryway table, and headed out through the garage to her car. Later that same morning, around 11:30, Charlotte's car was driving back down her quiet residential street, heading toward her house. She lived in a respectable, upper-middle-class neighborhood where pretty much all the neighbors knew each other by name. Historically, crime had been very low in the area. Although it was true that recently there had been a string of robberies nearby, which had put some of the residents on edge. But for the most part, Charlotte and her family always felt safe in their home. Charlotte was having a pretty hectic day. She'd had a very busy morning at work, then she'd gone to the salon for her scheduled haircut, and pretty soon she needed to get back to the office for a few more hours before her big afternoon meeting with her cousin Wayne and all the lawyers. The thing was, Charlotte never really liked how her hair looked immediately after leaving the salon. She always felt it was a bit too styled. So she wanted to make a quick stop at her house to restyle it herself before heading back to work to finish up her day. She pulled her car into the garage, got out, and ran inside the house. She went straight upstairs to the master bathroom. And just as she was plugging in her blow dryer, she heard a door open downstairs. The sound surprised her. She thought Kara was already off at her babysitting job, and Barry almost never came home for his lunch break. So she set the blow dryer down on the counter and went to go see who it was. A few hours later, around 4:30 in the afternoon, Charlotte's 21-year-old daughter Heather pulled her car up to the house. She had just arrived from her college, which was located a few towns away, and she was really excited to see her parents and her sister when they all got home from work that night. But as Heather parked her car in the driveway, she noticed something a little odd. She saw that the main garage door was wide open, and her mom's car was parked inside. This surprised her because when she had spoken to her mom on the phone the day before, Charlotte had specifically said she probably wouldn't be home until around 6 o'clock that evening. But Heather didn't think too much of it. She just figured her mom's plans had changed. So she grabbed her laundry hamper and a couple of big grocery bags filled with her belongings out of the back seat of her car. Then, as she walked into the garage to make her way into the house, she saw that the interior door, the one that led from the garage into the kitchen, was already open, but just a crack. This was also kind of strange. There was no real reason for that door to be left ajar. And so now, sensing that maybe something was a little bit off, Heather walked up to the door and slowly pushed it open. She called out for her mother, asking what she was doing home so early. But there was no answer. The house was completely silent. Heather stepped into the kitchen and set down her hamper and the bags on the floor. Then she began walking through the first floor of the house, trying to figure out where her mom was. She couldn't hear her, she couldn't see her. She walked from the kitchen, through the dining room, and as she rounded the corner into the main foyer, she saw her. Her mom was lying at the foot of the stairs, completely motionless. Heather immediately ran to her mom's side and grabbed her, trying to see if she was okay. But when she touched her mom's leg, it was ice cold to the touch. In a panic, Heather ran into the living room, snatched the phone from its cradle, and dialed 911. A few minutes later, Lieutenant Richard Carter of the Lynette Police Department sped down Charlotte's residential street with his lights flashing and his siren blaring. He was responding to a 911 call about a woman who had been found unresponsive. He had been very surprised when the dispatcher had told him whose house this woman had been found inside of. It was the home of the town's acting mayor, Barry Waits. As he pulled up in front of the home, he saw a young woman come running out the front door crying hysterically. Lieutenant Carter stopped his patrol car, got out, and he intercepted the young woman, who immediately begged him to come inside and help her mom. Carter and the young woman rushed over to the house together. He told her to stay outside on the porch while he went in to investigate. And she did. She stayed out front, just quietly weeping to herself, while Lieutenant Carter stepped through the front door. And right away, just inside the foyer, he saw what appeared to be a middle-aged woman lying on her back at the bottom of a staircase. She was completely still. Nearby, the contents of a woman's purse were strewn all across the floor. Carter immediately knelt down beside the woman and felt for a pulse on her neck, but there was nothing. So, Carter stood back up and just took a moment to assess the scene. The first thing he noticed was that there was a bit of foam at the corner of the woman's mouth. This made him wonder if maybe she had suffered a seizure or some sort of severe allergic reaction at the top of the stairs. Maybe she had lost her balance and fallen, and the fall had killed her. But then he also noticed that there were a few distinct drops of blood on the front of her blouse. And when he looked closer at her face, he saw that there were very obvious scratch marks on her chin and also a dark red mark that went all the way around her neck. And in that moment, he realized this woman had likely not just fallen down the stairs. It looked like she had been attacked, beaten, and potentially strangled to death. Later that day, around 5 o'clock in the evening, Lieutenant Richard Carter was carefully sorting through a pile of dirty laundry on the floor of Charlotte Waits' laundry room. For the past half an hour, he and his team had been scouring the crime scene for any possible clues, and now he was holding 2 white towels that were dotted with reddish-brown spots. They looked like blood that had just begun to dry. He called over a forensics officer and told him to bag the towels as evidence. He couldn't be sure yet that the blood even belonged to Charlotte, but if it did, it could be a very important clue. After searching the entire house, Carter actually had a pretty strong theory about what had happened to Charlotte. There were no signs of forced entry anywhere. The television and other valuables were all still in their proper places. Charlotte's purse had been dumped out on the floor just a few feet away from the stairs, but all of her cash and her credit cards were still inside her wallet. So Carter did not think this was a simple robbery gone wrong. He thought that maybe the killer had just dumped out the purse at the very end to try to make it seem like a robbery, but it was a very weak attempt. This did not look like a robbery at all. What this seemed like, at least to Carter at this point, was that Charlotte had been intentionally killed by somebody that she knew. But just then, Carter heard a commotion coming from near the front door. He went to go see what was going on, and he saw a man out on the doorstep who was literally being physically held back by 2 of his forensics officers. After a second, Carter recognized who it was. It was the town's mayor, Barry Waits, the victim's husband. The officers were trying to keep him outside to prevent him from seeing the scene, but Barry pushed right past them. And right away, he saw what they were trying to keep him from seeing. He saw his wife's body lying there on the floor, obviously dead. And when Barry saw that, he just froze in place and began to hyperventilate. At this point, Carter didn't try to force Barry back outside. Instead, he gently grabbed Barry's arm and led him into the next room. He sat him down on the couch and just tried to get him to calm down, but it was like he couldn't catch his breath. Barry was gasping for air and was really struggling to breathe. Then he actually doubled over and clutched at his chest. Carter thought for a second that he might be having a heart attack. So, instead of trying to talk to him, he just yelled for somebody to call an ambulance. Later that same night, around 8 o'clock, Lieutenant Carter stepped into the lobby of the local hospital's emergency department. He showed his badge to the nurse at the front desk and then asked if he could see Barry Waits. But the nurse told him he would have to wait. They were still running tests on Barry, and he couldn't have any visitors until they were absolutely sure that he was stable. Carter was pretty disappointed to hear this, not because he was desperate to get in there and console the grieving mayor. It was because he needed to talk to the mayor. As the spouse of a potential murder victim, he needed to know what Barry knew as soon as possible. So, he turned to leave. But before he did, he noticed 2 young women sitting in the waiting room. One of them was Barry and Charlotte's daughter, Heather. Carter and Heather had spoken for a few minutes back at the house earlier that day, when she was the one who came running out and directed him inside. They had talked a little bit, but Carter thought to himself, you know what? If I can't talk to Barry right now, maybe I can talk to Heather. Maybe she's calmed down enough that we could have a real conversation. And so he walked over to her. As Carter approached, Heather looked up and she definitely recognized who he was. She sort of gave off body language that it was okay for him to come and sit down. And so Carter walked over and sat down next to her. He saw that there was another girl, a teenager, sitting next to Heather. Heather quickly turned and pointed to her and said that this was her younger sister, Kara. Lieutenant Carter nodded and introduced himself to Kara. Then he asked both of them how their dad was doing. Heather explained that so far, the doctors believed he was not having a heart attack, that it was most likely a severe panic attack. But they were going to monitor him overnight just to be sure. Both of the girls seemed incredibly upset. They had tears in their eyes, and they both appeared to be in a state of shock. They hadn't really done anything suspicious, but Carter knew he couldn't just rule them out as suspects yet. He had to ask them some pointed questions. So he took out his notebook, and as delicately as he could, he began asking them what they knew. By this point, Carter's officers had already learned that Charlotte had left her work around 11 o'clock that morning. It wasn't until about 1 o'clock in the afternoon that her coworkers had called her house because she hadn't come back to the office. They said there was no answer. And so that meant the murder had likely taken place sometime between 11 in the morning and 1 in the afternoon. With that timeline in mind, Carter asked Heather and Kara where they had been during that specific window of time. Kara told him that she had been babysitting all day, and Heather said she had been at her college, which was 30 miles away, until around 4 o'clock that afternoon, when she had left to drive to her parents' house. At some point, Carter asked both of them if they had any idea if there was someone out there who might have had a grudge against their mother or who might have wanted to hurt her. The girls immediately shook their heads and said, absolutely not. There was no one. Their mom was wonderful and everybody seemed to like her. They insisted they were just a happy, normal family with no major issues that they knew of. Carter jotted all of this down in his notebook, and his plan was to check out the daughters' alibis as soon as he got back to the station. The next day, Lieutenant Carter was at the precinct, debriefing with the other investigators who were assigned to Charlotte's case. He had listened to the local news on the radio while he was driving to work that morning. And since Charlotte was the acting mayor's wife, her murder was all anybody in town could talk about. Carter was really feeling a lot of pressure to solve this case quickly. By this point, he had already followed up on Heather and Kara's alibis, and they had both checked out completely. Neither of the daughters could have been at the house between 11 and 1, so Carter had officially ruled them out as suspects. Now, the other officers were going around the room, basically updating Carter on what they had done the night before. And Carter was admittedly a little frustrated to hear that after they had questioned all of Charlotte's neighbors and her coworkers right after they had gotten to the scene, none of that had led to any new suspects. Another point of frustration was that the one person who likely would be able to help them the most, at least at this early stage in the investigation, was the acting mayor, Barry, Charlotte's husband, but he was still in the hospital and was not being allowed to speak to the police. But just as Carter and the other officers were sort of scratching their heads, wondering what their next move was going to be, the front door of the precinct opened. And who walked in but Barry Waits himself? A few minutes later, Lieutenant Carter and Barry were sitting in Carter's office. Barry said he had just been released from the hospital. They had determined that his heart was fine and that he had indeed just had a severe panic attack. So, as soon as he was out of the hospital, he had come right over to the police station to see what he could do to help with the investigation. Carter asked Barry to walk him through what he had done the previous day, the day that Charlotte was killed. Barry said that on top of being the acting mayor, he was also the head of the local National Guard armory, and he had been attending to business at the armory all day. He did say that he had left at some point to get a haircut, maybe mid-morning, but the barbershop had been closed, so he had gone right back to work. And he had stayed there until around 4:30, when he got a panicked phone call from his daughter Heather, telling him their mom was unresponsive in the house. As Barry spoke, Carter was primarily just looking at Barry's hands and his arms. He was looking for any scratches or cuts or bruises. The running theory, based on what they had seen at the crime scene, was that Charlotte had put up a fight against her attacker before she was killed. And so presumably there should be wounds of some kind on the attacker, most likely on their hands and arms. But as Carter stared at Barry, he could see no visible injuries at all. And also, Barry's story seemed very linear, very simple, and he seemed very earnest about it and eager to help. So, Carter couldn't just jump to conclusions and assume that Barry was telling the truth and that he wasn't a suspect. But Carter's first impression was that Barry was being honest. At some point, Carter shifted the conversation and asked Barry if he had any idea who might have wanted to hurt his wife. And Barry said yes, he did. He said there were actually two people who would definitely benefit from Charlotte being dead. He explained that the first person was a guy named Dave Reed, who was their daughter Kara's boyfriend. He said that he and Charlotte had tried to stop Kara from seeing this guy because he was a bad influence, but the teens had kept sneaking around, and eventually Dave had gotten Kara pregnant. So Barry wondered if maybe Dave had gone over to the house to sort of confront Charlotte, to maybe demand to be able to see Kara, and things had gotten out of hand. Carter grabbed a pen and he wrote down Dave's full name. Then he asked about the second person who had been a problem for Charlotte. Barry explained that his wife and her cousin, Wayne, were in the middle of this contentious dispute over an inheritance. In fact, he said, Charlotte had been scheduled to meet with Wayne and their attorneys on the very same day that she was killed. And when he heard this, Carter sat up straight in his chair. He thought to himself that the timing here could not possibly be a coincidence. The cousin was suddenly his top suspect. The following day, Carter walked into an interrogation room at the Lynette police station, and he sat down across the table from two people, Wayne Rice and his attorney. When Carter had called Wayne to set up this meeting, Wayne had responded by saying he would not say a single word without his lawyer present. And this had immediately made Carter pretty suspicious. During that very brief phone call, Carter had never even suggested to Wayne that he was a suspect in his cousin's murder. So when Carter sat down with Wayne and his lawyer, he leaned right in and started to grill him. He wanted to know what was going on with this inheritance. Wayne said he knew that his contesting their uncle's will had caused a lot of problems within the family, but he swore that he hadn't wished any harm on Charlotte. In fact, he claimed she had been his best ally at the time of her death. Carter asked him to explain what he meant by that. Wayne said that the last time he spoke to Charlotte, she seemed to be in favor of giving him some of the land that their uncle had left to her. According to Wayne, Charlotte had said she was really upset about the family being torn apart over money, and she felt like keeping all the land for herself just wasn't worth the conflict. And when Carter heard this, he was pretty surprised. Barry had made it sound like Charlotte had no intention of giving up the land to Wayne, like that wasn't even an option on the table. So Carter wondered if anything Wayne was saying here was even true. He asked Wayne for his alibi, and Wayne said he had literally been at work all day at an aluminum processing plant just outside of town. He said he hadn't even left for lunch that day, which was something he typically did. He insisted he was at work, truly, all day. And then he also gave Carter the names of several of his coworkers who could confirm his whereabouts. Before Carter let Wayne go, he asked him if he could take his fingerprints. Wayne immediately looked over at his attorney. His attorney gave him a slight nod. And so Wayne looked back at Carter and said, okay. Later that same day, Carter sat down with the other suspect on his list, Kara's boyfriend, Dave. Dave was very moody and standoffish. He just seemed kind of annoyed that he was even there. When Carter asked him if he knew why he had been called to the station in the first place, Dave just kind of sighed and said, yeah, I do. He had heard about what happened to Kara's mother, and he knew that given his contentious relationship with her and her husband, that of course he was going to be viewed as a suspect, which to him was completely absurd. Carter just asked Dave point blank about his relationship with Kara's parents. Dave admitted that, yeah, they definitely didn't like him. But Dave insisted he would never hurt Charlotte or Barry for that matter. And he hadn't even been in town the day that she was killed. He had been at work all day, at a landscaping job miles away. Carter asked for the names of some of Dave's coworkers to verify his alibi, and he also asked him to provide his fingerprints. Dave sort of rolled his eyes and said, "You're wasting your time," but he agreed to do it just because he wanted to clear his name. A couple of weeks later, in the middle of August, Lieutenant Carter sat at his desk, flipping through Charlotte's autopsy report, which he had just received from the medical examiner. And he realized that Charlotte's murder had been even more brutal than he had initially thought. It turned out the murder weapon had been Charlotte's own blouse. Her killer had grabbed the two long strings that were dangling from her neckline and had used them to strangle her to death. She had also received a pretty serious head injury that could have been fatal on its own, and she also had a broken wrist. This level of violence made Carter feel even more sure that this murder had to have been personal. But as he read deeper into the report, the physical evidence seemed to paint a different picture. There were 3 sets of fingerprints that had been found at the crime scene. 2 of them belonged to Barry and Kara, which was not a surprise at all because they lived in the house. But the 3rd set of prints was unidentified. And it wasn't a match for any of the suspects on Carter's radar, including Kara's boyfriend Dave and Charlotte's cousin Wayne. So, at this point, Lieutenant Carter just felt kind of stuck. To make matters worse, Barry, Wayne, and Dave's alibis had all checked out as well. So, truly, his list of suspects was basically down to 0. If Charlotte had been killed by someone she knew, which was still the initial running theory, Carter was going to have to dig even harder to find out who it was. In October of 1998, a couple of months after Charlotte Waits was killed, Lieutenant Carter walked into the Lynette Police Precinct right as the desk sergeant was hanging up the phone. The sergeant stopped Carter and told him they had just gotten yet another call on the Charlotte Waits tip line. And before the sergeant even explained what the caller had said, Carter felt a sense of dread building in the pit of his stomach. Ever since the police had set up this tip line for information on Charlotte's murder, it had been flooded with calls basically every single day. But rather than all these tips helping with the case, the tip line had actually just slowed the investigation down. Carter and his team had to take valuable time to follow up on every single one of these leads, even though most of them were just rumors and wild conspiracy theories. By this point, from all these tips, they'd looked into a young man who lived on the same street as Charlotte and who had a history of robbing houses, but he had an airtight alibi. They had also investigated another local man who had strangled his girlfriend in a way that was similar to how Charlotte was attacked, but he also had an alibi. Carter had even driven all the way to Georgia to investigate a tip that a small-time criminal had bragged at a party about killing Charlotte, only to find out that this criminal had an alibi too, and that the tipster had made the whole story up just to get him in trouble. Adding to the confusion, their fingerprint expert had told Carter that the 3rd unidentified set of prints found at the scene could possibly belong to a child, and so it might be totally unrelated to the murder. So now, as Carter looked over at the desk sergeant who was getting ready to tell him about whatever call he had just had, Carter just braced himself for more bad news, because all these tip calls were basically bad news. And when the desk sergeant spoke, it was indeed more bad news. The sergeant said this call wasn't even a tip at all. A local woman had just called in to complain about the lack of progress in the investigation. As difficult as it was for Carter to hear that now, in addition to all the pressure he was feeling that locals were literally spamming the hotline just to complain about him, he also understood their frustration. He was feeling just as upset as everybody else in town. But after running into nothing but dead ends, he was completely out of ideas. And he had a sinking feeling in his gut that unless something major changed soon, this case, unfortunately, was going to go cold. Fast forward about 3 years to one morning in 2001. On this day, Lieutenant Carter was working at his desk when he heard a familiar sound. The precinct's tip line was ringing yet again. After that initial wave of tips on the Charlotte Waits case, the investigation had completely stalled out for a couple of years. It was basically cold. Carter had ultimately been reassigned to other cases, and Charlotte's family had just sort of been forced to move on without any sort of closure. Kara had her baby, and Heather had graduated from college and was working a real job. And Barry had also basically moved on with his life. He had gotten remarried and was still very much involved in local politics. In fact, just the previous year, he had run for a term on the city council. However, during that election cycle, Barry's opponent had publicly accused him of killing his wife Charlotte. And even though he had no actual evidence to support his accusation, aside from the bizarre fact that he had a dream about it, all the media attention from these accusations had totally reinvigorated the case. And calls had once again begun flowing into the tip line. However, just like before, the vast majority of these tips were just wild theories and local gossip. But on that particular day, when the desk sergeant who manned the tip line opened up Carter's office door, Carter looked up and saw that the sergeant was visibly excited. whatever he had just heard on the tip line actually mattered. And before Carter could even ask him what he had heard, the desk sergeant said he had just spoken to two tipsters who clearly had some real information that they wanted to share, information that was going to blow this case wide open. Based on that crucial tip, the forensic evidence and new witness testimony, this is what police believe actually happened to Charlotte Waits on the 4th of August, 1998. Around 11:30 in the morning, the killer pulled up outside of Charlotte's house, and right away, they recognized Charlotte's car parked in the garage. When they saw it, their heart raced with a mix of excitement and anxiety because they hadn't been sure that she would even be home. But clearly, the killer had arrived at just the right time. So they parked their car at the end of the driveway, they walked up into the open garage, and they went over to the interior door that led into the house. They tried the handle and found that it was unlocked. So they opened it up. The killer stepped inside the kitchen, and right away they heard footsteps on the second floor. They knew it had to be Charlotte. There was nobody else home at this time of day. The killer quietly closed the door behind them. They went around to the stairs that led to the second floor, and up they went. And right as the killer reached the second floor hallway, Charlotte came out of the bathroom and saw them standing there. Charlotte was definitely very surprised to see them. The killer immediately just asked her a question, point blank. And when she answered the question, it was not what the killer wanted to hear. So the killer tried to get her to change her mind to answer this question differently. But the conversation quickly escalated into a full-blown argument. And then the killer just totally lost their temper and hit Charlotte hard across the face. Blood immediately began pouring from Charlotte's nose. Stunned, she just stepped back and went back into the bathroom to grab a towel to blot her face with it. At this point, the killer knew they had crossed a line. Persuading Charlotte to do what they wanted was now clearly out of the question. This was a point of no return. So, as Charlotte came out of the bathroom with a towel pressed to her face, looking totally shaken up, the killer walked up and grabbed her from behind. They clutched the long strings that were hanging from the neckline of her blouse, and they pulled them tight around her neck. Charlotte began gasping for breath and trying to fight them off, but the killer had her in an unbreakable chokehold. And then finally, when Charlotte had lost enough oxygen that she stopped struggling, the killer let go of the strings and then kicked her down the staircase. When the killer saw what they had done, when they saw Charlotte at the base of the stairs, motionless and very likely dead, the reality of what had just happened finally hit them. In a panic, they grabbed the bloody towel that Charlotte had dropped on the floor. They rushed down the stairs and quickly cleaned up the rest of the blood on Charlotte's face, and then they dumped the towels in the laundry room. Then they grabbed Charlotte's purse off a nearby table and scattered its contents on the floor near her body, hoping the police would think this was just a robbery gone wrong. And then after that, they fled the house, got back in their car, and hurried back to work at the National Guard Armory before anyone even noticed they were gone. The killer was Lynette, Alabama's mayor and Charlotte's own husband, Barry Waits. Barry had secretly gotten himself into a lot of debt, and he needed the full inheritance from Charlotte's uncle to pay it all off. And so when Barry went to his own home in the middle of the day and confronted Charlotte, asking her, "What do you plan to do at this meeting with Wayne? Are you going to give him some of this inheritance?" And she told him that yes, her plan was to settle and split the inheritance. Well, when Barry heard that, he snapped. He killed his wife. Not just because he was mad at her for her decision, but also because he desperately needed more money. He was thinking, okay, I'm only going to get half of this inheritance because she's giving the other half to Wayne. But if I kill her, I'll also get her life insurance policy, and then together I'll have enough to pay off my debts. However, when the insurance company went to pay out the claim, because Barry was clearly a suspect in his wife's murder early on in the investigation, the company refused to pay him the money. Instead, they paid the insurance money directly to their daughters, Heather and Cara. But a couple of years later, Barry still tried to get his hands on that money by tricking his own daughters into signing it over to him. But when Heather and Cara realized what he was doing, they finally saw their father for what he truly was. And so, it was the daughters who were the tipsters who broke this case wide open. They told Lieutenant Carter everything they knew about their dad's very suspicious behavior, along with his clear financial motives for the murder. They also said that their father had intimidated them into hiding information from the police and had even called in fake tips himself to redirect attention away from him. Barry Waits was arrested in February of 2006, and 9 months later, he was found guilty of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to 40 years in prison. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. For nearly 10 years, a brutal murder sat unsolved, not because there were no suspects, not because there were no clues, but because the most important piece of evidence was misunderstood. It wasn't hidden. It wasn't lost. It was right there in plain sight. And when investigators finally realized what it meant, it didn't just point to a killer, it exposed something far more disturbing than anyone had imagined. But it would take nearly a decade and the help of a secretive group of elite crime solvers to finally see it for what it really was. If you're drawn to stories that are strange, dark, and deeply unsettling, then you're in the right place. Let's get into it. When classes began at Drexel University in Philadelphia on the cold morning of the 30th of November 1984, the campus was buzzing with its usual energy. Students were rushing to get to their classrooms, shivering in the chilly autumn air. But as some of those students were walking into Randall Hall, they made a gruesome discovery that would change the university forever. Crumpled at the bottom of an outdoor stairwell, hidden underneath a heavy gray jacket, was the body of a young woman. Her face was covered in deep cuts and severe bruising, showing that she had been brutally beaten. Around her neck, there was a deep, dark purple line where she had been strangled to death. She had no purse, no backpack, and absolutely nothing on her person to identify who she was. She was fully clothed, and there was no immediate evidence of sexual assault, but there was one very bizarre detail that stood out. She was completely missing her shoes and her socks. Her bare feet were exposed to the freezing air. The police were called to the scene immediately. They cordoned off the entire outdoor stairwell with yellow tape and began their investigation. Their very first suspicion was that this was a simple robbery that had turned deadly. But right away, the police knew they were in for a very difficult investigation. The first major hurdle was that there were absolutely no security cameras inside or outside of Randall Hall. This meant they could not just review footage to see who had been walking around the building. The second major hurdle was that Drexel University was not an isolated, closed-off campus. Its buildings were completely integrated into the urban streets of West Philadelphia. Randall Hall itself was located right along a known cut-through path that local residents used almost every single day to walk through the neighborhood. This meant there was a virtually unlimited number of potential suspects. To make matters worse, as the investigators analyzed the scene, it became very clear that this young woman had not been killed in this stairwell. She had been killed somewhere else and then dragged a great distance to this spot. The dragging process was likely how she lost her shoes and socks. The killer had then dumped her body at the bottom of the stairs and covered her with her own gray jacket. But just a couple of hours after the body was discovered, the police received a very lucky break. A young man who was incredibly combative and frantic rushed toward the closed-off crime scene. He was trying to push his way past the officers and demanded that they let him through because he said he knew the identity of the dead girl. The police were immediately suspicious of this. They had not released any details to the public, and they had not even identified the victim themselves. They pulled the young man aside and began interviewing him. He told the police his name was Kurt Rayner, and he was a student at Drexel. He said he believed the dead girl was his girlfriend, 20-year-old Debbie Wilson, who was also a student. He then proceeded to give the police a very long and highly complicated explanation of how he had figured out the identity of the victim. Kurt said that the night before, he had been with Debbie in the computer lab located in the basement of Randall Hall. He explained that Debbie had a massive project due the next day, and he had offered to keep her company while she worked on it. But by about 1:30 inches the morning, Debbie still had a lot of work left to do. Kurt said he was just incredibly tired and did not think he could stay awake any longer. So, he asked Debbie if it would be okay if he went back to his dorm early. Debbie told him it was totally fine. She was used to working late in the computer lab and felt perfectly safe. Kurt said that even though he wanted to stick around and walk her safely to her car when she was done, he felt like she would be okay, so he took off on his own. On his walk back to the dorm, Kurt said he passed by a campus security guard. He actually stopped and asked the guard if he would mind checking on his girlfriend in the basement computer lab because she was all alone and it was very late. The security guard told him it was no problem and that he would make sure she was okay. The next morning, when Kurt woke up, he heard rumors from other students about a young woman's body being found outside Randall Hall and that it looked like a murder. Kurt said he did not think much of it at first. But later that day, when he went to campus to meet up with Debbie, he saw her car still parked in the computer lab parking lot, looking like it had never moved. And then, when he arrived at their designated meeting spot, Debbie never showed up. He said it was at that exact point that he realized the dead woman in Randall Hall had to be Debbie. And he was not wrong. It was indeed Debbie. But the police were absolutely not buying his story. He was the last person known to have seen Debbie alive. And by his own admission, he had heard that morning about a dead woman being found at the very place he had left his girlfriend all alone, yet he waited hours before bringing this up to anyone. The police also noticed something highly alarming on his hands. Kurt had fresh bruises on his knuckles and a deep cut between his fingers. Suddenly, Kurt seemed like the primary suspect. The nature of the crime suggested a deeply personal motive. Strangulation is a highly intimate act. The killer is almost always face-to-face with their victim, and it requires a massive amount of physical strength and rage to complete. Afterward, the killer had covered Debbie's body with her own jacket, which is an act that investigators know indicates remorse, guilt, or respect for the victim. Generally, when a young woman is murdered, her romantic partner is the very first suspect. But instead of tipping Kurt off that they were focusing on him, the detectives told him to go back to his dorm room and that they would be in touch with him as the investigation developed. In the meantime, the investigators turned their attention to the computer lab in the basement of Randall Hall. They found the computer that Debbie had been using. She had logged in to start her project, but had never logged out. Her computer cursor was left blinking mid-sentence. The timestamp of her last activity was exactly 1:38 a.m., just 8 minutes after Kurt said he left her. This led investigators to believe she was interrupted by her attacker inside the lab. As they swept the room, they found 2 extension cords on the floor near her computer that perfectly matched the ligature marks on Debbie's neck. They also found a small spot of blood on the back of Debbie's chair, which they carefully collected and sent off for testing. But as the police looked around the lab, they realized they had suffered a massive setback. The computer lab and the hallway right outside looked incredibly neat and clean. It turned out that the university janitor had cleaned the entire area earlier that morning, likely destroying critical physical evidence without realizing a crime had been committed. The police interviewed the janitor, who had a rock-solid alibi, and was devastated to learn she had cleaned a crime scene. When asked if she noticed anything strange, she said everything seemed normal, but she did recall that the tables and chairs inside the lab had been moved and pushed around. She had not thought much of it because students often moved the furniture while studying. Because the police lacked any physical evidence, they could not arrest Kurt. Instead, they asked him to come down to the station for a formal interview. During the questioning, Kurt vehemently insisted he had nothing to do with Debbie's death. As for the bruises and the cut on his hand, he claimed he had punched a concrete wall in a fit of grief after finding out what had happened to Debbie. He said the cut between his fingers was from working on his car a few days earlier. Since neither of those statements could be disproven and they had no physical evidence linking him to the crime, the police had to let him go. They then began digging deeper into his alibi. Kurt had told them that he passed a security guard on his walk back to his dorm and asked him to check on Debbie. The police tracked down that security guard, whose name was Bryce Clapman. Clapman was a longtime employee of Drexel with a stellar work record and no criminal history. Clapman completely confirmed Kurt's story. He said he spoke with Kurt around 1:30 inches the morning. After their conversation, Clapman used his radio to contact Bronson Ziegler, who was one of the two security guards working inside Randall Hall that night. Clapman told Ziegler that he or the other guard on duty, David Dixon, needed to go down to the basement and check on the girl. Clapman also mentioned that shortly after making that call, he saw a figure, presumably a student, walking outside Randall Hall. He said it was too dark and he was too far away to see any features, but he definitely saw someone walking around the premises around 1:30 a.m. Clapman stated he never went inside Randall Hall that night and volunteered to take a lie detector test. The police then ran background checks on the two guards who were inside Randall Hall, Bronson Ziegler and David Dixon. Dixon was a military veteran with a pristine record who was still active in the Army Reserves. Ziegler, however, had a much darker past. It turned out he had spent time in jail for burglary and had actually lied about his criminal record to get his job as a security guard. When police interviewed Ziegler, he was incredibly evasive, defensive, and frustrated. He admitted he received the message from Clapman to check on the girl, but said he did not feel like doing it himself. So, he claimed he radioed Dixon and told him to go do it instead. Ziegler insisted he had performed his security rounds properly. He told detectives they could check his security clock. This clock was a device that guards carried with them, which required them to insert keys located at designated stations along their route, stamping a physical card with the exact time of their arrival. When the police checked Ziegler's punch card, it showed he had hit all his stations at the correct times. But the detectives knew this did not clear him, as there was plenty of time in between his rounds to commit the crime. Toward the end of his interview, Ziegler became angry and sarcastically told detectives that yes, he killed Debbie, and then flatly refused to take a lie detector test. When the police interviewed David Dixon, he gave a completely different account. He said Ziegler had never radioed him and had never asked him to check on the girl in the computer lab. However, Dixon did say he was aware someone was working late. He explained that around 2:15 inches the morning, he walked past the basement lab, saw the lights on, and heard the loud sound of printers working inside. Not wanting to disturb whoever was in there, he did not look inside. He said he spent the next couple of hours talking on the phone with his girlfriend. Then, around 4:0 inches the morning, he went back to the lab. The lights were off and the door was locked, so he assumed they had finished and left and that Ziegler had locked up. When asked why neither he nor Ziegler had discovered Debbie's body, Dixon explained that their security rounds did not extend outside the building, so they never would have seen her in the outdoor stairwell. At this point, Bryce Clapman and David Dixon were ruled out as suspects, but Bronson Ziegler became their primary focus. However, just like with the boyfriend Kurt, there was no physical evidence tying Ziegler to the crime, so they could not arrest him. The investigators decided to try and identify the mysterious person Clapman had seen walking around Randall Hall at 1:30 a.m. After conducting interviews, they discovered it was a 28-year-old PhD student named Ashlyn Berhard. Berhard was known for keeping very long hours in his office, which happened to be located directly above the outdoor stairwell where Debbie was found. But he was also known for some highly disturbing behavior. Several female secretaries in his department reported that Berhard had a habit of creeping up behind them and suddenly holding a sharp pencil to their necks, threatening to kill them. When interviewed, Berhard admitted he was in Randall Hall that night, but claimed he did not know Debbie and had not left his office all night. He agreed to take a lie detector test, but failed it. When confronted, he scrambled for an explanation and named two other graduate students who could provide an alibi. But when police spoke to those students, they said Berhard had left the office around 10 the morning and was gone for about 3 hours. Berhard then claimed he had simply forgotten to mention that he left to take a nap in one of the study rooms, and that it was just a coincidence his nap coincided with the murder. The detectives did not believe him, but once again they had no physical evidence linking him to the crime. The police continued to look for other suspects. They began speaking to Debbie's friends, and that is when they learned that Debbie had a stalker. It was another student named Alan Smith. Alan had been a close friend of Debbie's, but when he tried to make the relationship romantic, Debbie rejected him. Alan did not take it well. He began following Debbie around campus, trying to force her to talk to him. Just the day before Debbie was killed, friends had witnessed a massive fight between them in the middle of campus, where Alan had grabbed Debbie's shoulder, shook her, and screamed in her face. The police tracked Alan down, but he had no alibi, claiming he was alone in his apartment. Like all the other suspects, there was no physical evidence tying him to the crime. Around this time, the lab results from the small spot of blood found on the back of Debbie's chair finally came back. Since DNA profiling did not exist in 1984, the lab could only determine the blood type. The test showed the blood was type A. Debbie's blood was type O, meaning this drop of blood almost certainly belonged to her killer, who must have been cut during the struggle. The police immediately obtained blood samples from Kurt Rayner, Bronson Ziegler, Ashlyn Berhard, and Alan Smith. They were confident that one of them would be type A. But when the results came back, not a single one of them had type A blood. It was a crushing blow to the entire investigation. With no suspects left, the case began to stall. A wave of panic swept through the Drexel University campus. Students were outraged by the lack of security and demanded that guards be allowed to carry weapons. The university offered a $10,000 reward, and the president advised everyone to use the buddy system, stating he believed the killer was likely someone from their own community. No one could understand why anyone would target Debbie. She was a wonderfully kind young woman who worked incredibly hard. She had modeled in high school, but was not vain, even turning down braces because she was worried it would ruin her clarinet playing. She kept a picture of a Mercedes-Benz above her desk to keep herself motivated. That picture was still hanging there after she was gone. Her hard work had put her in danger that night, as she was determined to stay as late as necessary to finish her project. The physical evidence they did have did not seem to make sense. It did not appear to be a simple robbery. While she was missing her shoes and socks, she was still wearing an expensive watch. About a week after the murder, her backpack mysteriously turned up in the campus lost and found. No one knew who put it there, but all of her belongings were still intact inside. The police chased down every lead, but eventually the case went completely cold. In 1985, the Philadelphia Inquirer ran a story about the unsolved cases that haunted detectives the most, and Debbie's was at the top of the list. The lead investigators admitted they believed it was a random attack and feared the killer would strike again. Fast forward to the spring of 1992. Debbie's murder had been languishing in a cold case file for 8 years. The case was finally assigned to a new cold case squad led by Detective Bob Snyder. Desperate for a breakthrough, Snyder decided to throw a Hail Mary. He took the entire case file to the Vidocq Society. This was a private, highly exclusive club of elite criminology experts who met once a month in Philadelphia to review unsolved cases. The members included top homicide detectives, prosecutors, defense attorneys, FBI agents, forensic scientists, and even an aeronautic physicist. During one of their closed-door meetings, Detective Snyder stood before the society and presented every detail of Debbie Wilson's murder. For several hours, the members of the society debated the details, but could not find a way forward. Then, a man named Richard Walter stood up. Walter was a founding member of the society and a world-renowned criminal psychologist who had spent his career profiling dangerous killers. Walter looked at the crime scene details and told the detectives that they had missed the most important clue in the entire case: Debbie's missing shoes and socks. The original investigators had assumed they had simply fallen off while her body was being dragged. But Walter argued that while shoes might fall off, socks almost never slide off completely during dragging. He proposed that the killer had deliberately taken her white Reebok sneakers and her socks as trophies. Walter believed the killer was a power-assertive, macho type of personality who possessed a severe pathological foot fetish. Detective Snyder was intrigued by this profile and decided to bring the theory back to his team. They began reopening the case and re-interviewing everyone involved. When they spoke to the former manager of the computer lab at Randall Hall, he mentioned a small detail that had always bothered him. He told the detectives that the high-speed printers in the basement lab were connected to a central university system that was programmed to automatically shut down at exactly 10 p.m. every single night. Therefore, there was absolutely no way anyone could have heard printers running in that lab in the middle of the night. When Detective Snyder heard this, he was stunned. He immediately remembered the statement of David Dixon, the pristine military veteran who had been ruled out as a suspect. Dixon had claimed that at 2:15 inches the morning, he had walked past the computer lab and decided not to check inside because he heard the loud sound of the printers running. If the printers shut off at 10 p.m., Dixon was lying. The detectives immediately began looking much more closely at David Dixon. They requested his complete military record from the Army, and when they looked at the very back of his file, they found a disciplinary report from 1979. The report stated that during his first year of service, Dixon had been arrested for breaking into another soldier's barracks locker. The only item he had stolen was a pair of dirty, used white Reebok sneakers. This was the exact type of shoe that Debbie was known to wear. The police then began tracking down Dixon's former and current neighbors. They interviewed several women who had lived next to him over the years. At least 4 of these women reported that their apartments had been broken into while they were away. But what was bizarre was that the intruder had ignored their cash, jewelry, and electronics. The only things that were ever stolen were their used white athletic shoes and their dirty socks. None of the women had ever been able to find out who was responsible, but they all lived right next door to David Dixon. Armed with this evidence, Detective Snyder obtained a search warrant for Dixon's apartment. When officers conducted the search, they opened his closet and found a disturbing collection. Tucked away in the back were 20 pairs of used women's white athletic shoes, each pair meticulously wrapped in individual plastic bags to preserve them as trophies. They also uncovered 77 homemade video cassettes. When they played the tapes, they found hours of footage that Dixon had secretly recorded of women's feet as they walked around the campus and the city, always focusing on their white shoes. The detectives then went to interview Dixon's ex-wife, who had been his girlfriend on the night of the murder. Dixon had claimed his alibi was that he had spent hours on the phone chatting with her, but when the detectives spoke to her, she completely shattered his story. She told them that they had only spoken for a couple of minutes that night, not hours. Dixon had lied to the police to cover up his whereabouts during the exact hours that Debbie was killed. In June of 1993, the police officially arrested David Dixon and charged him with the first-degree murder of Debbie Wilson. While he refused to speak to the detectives and maintained his innocence, he could not keep his mouth shut once he was placed in a jail cell. Dixon began bragging to his cellmate about the crime. He told him in graphic detail how he had snuck into the computer lab, confronted Debbie, and killed her because he wanted to have his way with her feet and take her shoes as a prize. The cellmate, completely disgusted, immediately reported the confession to the guards. At the trial, the prosecution presented a mountain of evidence, including the stolen shoes, the videotapes, the broken alibi, and the cellmate's testimony. David Dixon was found guilty of the murder of Debbie Wilson and was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The tragedy of Debbie's death left a deep, permanent scar on her family and the Drexel community. For nearly 10 years, her loved ones had to live with the agonizing pain of not knowing who had taken her away or why. Her dreams of graduating, playing her clarinet, and one day driving that Mercedes-Benz were stolen from her in an instant, all because of a predator's bizarre and deadly obsession. But because of the dedication of a relentless detective and the brilliant minds of the Vidocq Society, justice was finally served and a dangerous killer was taken off the streets forever. In this case, the truth was never hidden. It was simply overlooked. So, the next time something doesn't make sense, it might be worth asking, what small detail are we missing? Let me know what you think in the comments.
On the morning of the 8th of December, 1995, 41-year-old Bonnie Sanborn walked through her Tucson, Arizona home, believing she was dealing with the biggest problem in her life. She had no idea that within the next 24 hours, she would vanish from her own bedroom in one of the most violent crimes the city had seen that year. At the time, though, the morning felt ordinary. Her youngest son was already sitting at the kitchen table eating cereal. The television hummed softly somewhere in the house. Sunlight spilled through the windows. Bonnie moved down the hallway with a cup of coffee in her hand, trying to get her children ready for school before the morning chaos got any worse. She stopped briefly at her daughter Candace's room, reminding the 13-year-old to hurry up. Candace barely looked up from the mirror. Bonnie sighed and continued farther down the hallway toward her 15-year-old son Bradley's bedroom. The door was shut. And behind it, Bonnie was about to discover something so bizarre, so alarming, that it would completely change the course of the next 24 hours. She knocked on his door, a solid, firm knock. There was no answer. She knocked again, a little louder this time, and called his name. Still nothing. She raised her voice, shouting through the closed door that if he didn't get out of that bed, she was coming in there to drag him out herself. It was a threat she'd made before, but today she really meant it. Yet, there was still no response from inside the room. A flicker of worry mixed with her frustration. She pressed her ear against the cool wood of the door, listening for any sign of movement. She was hoping to hear the rustle of sheets or the sound of a dresser drawer opening and closing. But that's not what she heard. Instead, a strange sound reached her ears. It was a rhythmic clanking noise, a harsh metallic sound, like someone was banging metal against metal over and over again. It was completely out of place for a quiet suburban morning. Her curiosity and concern now overriding her anger, Bonnie turned the doorknob and pushed the door open. The sight that greeted her made her stop dead in her tracks. There, in the middle of his bedroom floor, was her son, Bradley. And with him was his 18-year-old friend, Jason Horbachevsky. The two of them were crouched on the floor, sweat beading on their foreheads, using a crowbar and a hammer to try and pry open a large, heavy metal box. Bonnie stepped fully into the room, her eyes wide with disbelief. As she got a closer look, she realized what the box was. There was a phone receiver dangling off the side, its coiled cord twisted and broken. It was a payphone. A payphone that Bradley and Jason had very obviously stolen from somewhere on the street, and now they were trying to smash it open to get the quarters from inside. Bonnie was so completely shocked, so floored by the brazenness of it all, that the only words she could manage to get out were a quiet, "What are you doing?" Bradley looked up at his mom, his expression not one of guilt or fear, but of mild annoyance that he'd been interrupted. He just shrugged and said, "What?" "We're just trying to get the change out of this payphone," as if it were the most normal thing in the world. Before Bonnie could even begin to process his response, his friend Jason looked over his shoulder at her. He wasn't even trying to hide it. He just grinned and started laughing, a strange, hollow laugh that made Bonnie wonder if he was high on something. The complete lack of shame from either of them was what truly stunned her. At this point, Bonnie felt a wave of helplessness wash over her. She slowly backed out of the room and stood in the hallway, her mind racing. What was she supposed to do here? Her son was committing a felony right here in her house in the middle of the morning. It was so blatant, so defiant. She knew she'd been having problems with Bradley for a long time. This wasn't the first time she had caught him doing something he shouldn't. He was known to throw huge unauthorized parties at the house whenever she wasn't home. He was constantly picking fights with his siblings, with her, with just about everyone. And she knew, though he tried to hide it, that he was spending time with known gang members. For a long time, Bonnie had tried her best to be understanding. She remembered how difficult it was being a teenager, the pressures, the confusion. She tried to be supportive, to talk to him, to guide him. But his behavior just kept getting worse. The trouble was escalating, and this stolen payphone in his bedroom, felt like a breaking point. It was a line that had been crossed, a big one. She knew in her gut that if she let this slide, if she just yelled at him and let it go, he would just keep pushing the boundaries. He would keep going further and further until he got himself seriously hurt, or hurt someone else, or ended up in prison. This was the moment. She had to put her foot down, hard. So, without saying another word to Bradley or Jason, who had already gone back to hammering and prying at the metal box, she turned around. She walked with a determined stride back down the hallway, through the living room, and into the kitchen. Her other two children, Brandon and Candace, were now both at the table, eating their cereal and looking annoyed by the loud banging coming from their brother's room. Bonnie walked right past them, her face set like stone. She picked up the kitchen phone from its cradle on the wall and dialed 911. When the dispatcher answered, Bonnie's voice was steady as she said she wanted to report a theft. And then she gave the dispatcher her own address. After she hung up the phone, she turned to Candace and Brandon and told them to go get their backpacks and wait outside for the school bus. She didn't want them to see what was about to happen. A few minutes later, there was a knock on the front door. Bonnie opened it to find two sheriff's deputies standing on her porch. She recognized both of them, and she could tell from their expressions that they recognized her too. This wasn't the first time law enforcement had been called to the Sanborn house. They had been there several times in recent months to deal with domestic disputes, most of which were started by Bradley. As she led them inside, Bonnie felt a deep sense of failure. She was trying so hard to keep her family together, but it felt like it was falling apart at the seams. And it wasn't just Bradley. She was starting to see some of that same rebelliousness in Candace, who was acting out more and more lately. And she worried constantly about what would happen when her sweet little Brandon became a teenager. Would he follow in his older siblings' footsteps? She just didn't understand what she was doing wrong. Bonnie showed the deputies to Bradley's room. When they walked in, Bradley and Jason were still on the floor, completely engrossed in their work on the payphone. They hadn't even noticed the deputies arrive. When Bradley finally looked up and saw the two uniformed officers standing in his doorway, his face twisted in fury. He jumped to his feet and started screaming at his mother, yelling that he couldn't believe she had called the cops on him, on her own son. But Bonnie, steeling herself, pushed down the guilt that was clawing at her. She had to do this. For his own good. The deputies were calm and professional. They handcuffed both Bradley and Jason and led them out of the house. Bonnie followed close behind them, watching as they put the two teenagers in the back of the squad car. As one of the officers was about to close the door, Bonnie pulled him aside. She asked him, her voice low so the boys couldn't hear, if he could please make sure Bradley spent at least one night in the juvenile detention center. It felt like a terrible thing for a mother to ask, basically demanding that her own child be locked up. But she was desperate. She hoped that a night in juvenile hall would scare him straight. She also knew they offered counseling services there, and maybe, just maybe, someone could get through to him in a way she couldn't. The deputy nodded sympathetically and said he would see what he could do. As the squad car pulled away from the curb and drove down the street, Bonnie saw a curtain twitch in the window of the house across the street. She squinted and saw one of her neighbors peering out, trying to get a look at all the commotion. Further down the block, a couple who had been out for a morning jog had slowed to a walk and were now openly staring. Bonnie felt a hot flush of embarrassment creep up her neck. She knew the people in this neighborhood were already well aware of her family's struggles. It was impossible to hide. And it made it all so much worse because, to her face, her neighbors were generally nice. Some even went out of their way to offer help. But she wasn't naive. She knew that behind closed doors, behind her back, her family was the subject of constant gossip. It was humiliating and it was frustrating, but more than anything, it made her feel incredibly isolated. Her husband, Robert, was supposed to be her partner in all of this, but he had taken a job in Maryland and was only able to come home every other weekend. She had thought about selling the house in Tucson and moving the whole family out to be with him, but with the kids' behavior, the logistics just seemed overwhelming. The good news was that Robert had been talking to his boss about a transfer back to Tucson. He was supposed to be coming home for good next week. Bonnie was just trying to hold on until then. She was trying to survive. She felt so alone, but she kept telling herself that soon Robert would be back. He would be there to help her deal with the kids, the nosy neighbors, the police. Having her partner by her side would make all the difference. About 16 hours later, around 11:45 that night, Bonnie stood in her bathroom brushing her teeth. The house was finally quiet, a rare and welcome peace. The only sound was the low hum of the television coming from the living room. She had gotten a call from the juvenile detention center earlier that afternoon. Bradley was being held on theft charges, which Bonnie believed was for the best. His friend Jason, however, was 18, an adult in the eyes of the law. He wasn't held in custody. He was just given a ticket and released that same day. Bonnie knew that as soon as Bradley got out, he and Jason would be right back together, getting into the same old trouble. It was a discouraging thought. Before she went to her own room, Bonnie walked into the living room. Her other two kids, Candace and Brandon, were sprawled out on the couch, their eyes glued to the TV. She told them it was time for bed, that they needed to turn off the television and go to their rooms. But they just ignored her, completely absorbed in whatever they were watching. It was a Friday night, and neither of them had anywhere to be in the morning. Bonnie was just too tired to fight anymore. She had done enough fighting for one day. So, she just let it go. She told them not to stay up too late, and then she left them on the couch, went to her own bedroom at the end of the hall, and turned out the lights. A few hours later, something woke Bonnie up. She groggily rolled over and glanced at the glowing red numbers on her alarm clock. It was almost 3 a.m. She could still hear the TV on out in the living room. With a heavy sigh, Bonnie cracked open her bedroom door and yelled down the dark hallway for the kids to turn off the TV and go to bed, this time for real. As she settled back down under her covers, she heard the sound of the television finally clicking off. She heard footsteps padding down the hallway, and then the house was completely silent. She closed her eyes and drifted back to sleep. But sometime later, in the deep pre-dawn darkness, she woke up again. She wasn't sure what had woken her. The house was still silent. She rolled over in her bed, and as her eyes adjusted to the darkness, they focused on something in the room with her. It was a large figure, a silhouette standing silently right beside her bed, looking down at her. Later that same morning, around 10:45 a.m., 10-year-old Brandon woke up to a house that was eerily silent. On a normal Saturday morning, his mother would have already been up for hours, making breakfast, the smell of coffee filling the house, the sound of her moving around, getting a start on the weekend chores. But as Brandon walked out into the hallway, he didn't hear a thing. He went into the kitchen to see if she was there, but it was empty. There were no dirty pans in the sink, no fresh pot of coffee brewing. It looked like his mom hadn't even been awake yet, which was very strange for her. So he went to ask his older sister, Candace, if she knew where their mom was. But Candace, just waking up herself, said she hadn't seen her. So together, Brandon and Candace walked down the hallway to their mother's bedroom. They knocked on the door, but there was no answer. Brandon called out for her, "Mom?" Still nothing. He hesitated for a moment, then he pushed the door open and looked inside. And the sight that met his eyes made him gasp in horror. The room was covered in blood. But the bedroom was empty. His mom wasn't there. Later that same morning, Detective Brad Faust pulled his car up to the curb outside of a house in a quiet Tucson suburb. He was there to investigate what was being called an apparent kidnapping of a mother from her own home. Faust was feeling the strain of the job. 1995 had turned out to be the deadliest year in Tucson's history. There had already been nearly 100 murders in the county that year, and the Pima County Sheriff's Office was completely swamped. Faust was already juggling more cases than he could handle, and now he had another one. But at this point, all he knew was that a woman named Bonnie Sanborn was missing and that her kids had found blood in her bedroom. As far as anyone knew, this wasn't a murder yet. Faust was holding on to a sliver of hope that maybe this wasn't as bad as it sounded, that they would find Bonnie and that she would be okay. He got out of his car and saw that uniformed officers had already secured the scene with yellow crime scene tape. He saw a young boy and a teenage girl sitting on the front curb, their faces pale with shock and fear. Faust noticed that there was blood on both of their shirts. He correctly guessed that these must be Bonnie's kids, the ones who had called 911. He made a mental note that he would need to speak with them as soon as he could. He ducked under the tape, walked through the front yard, and went into the house. A crime scene photographer met him just inside the front door and led him down the hallway toward the master bedroom. As they walked, Faust's eyes were drawn to a family photo hanging on the wall. It showed Bonnie and her husband and their 3 children, all of them smiling, looking like the picture-perfect American family. Before they reached the bedroom, the photographer paused and turned to Faust. He warned the detective that it was bad in there, that there was a lot of blood. Faust just nodded grimly. The photographer opened the door, and Faust immediately understood the warning. The room was a nightmare. Blood was splattered across the walls, soaked into the carpet, smeared on the windows. The mattress on the bed was drenched in it. Faust felt his heart sink. He was a seasoned homicide detective, but this was one of the worst scenes he'd ever walked into. With this amount of blood loss, the chances of finding their victim alive were practically zero. But he knew they couldn't figure out what happened to her or who was responsible until they found her body. Faust carefully stepped into the room, moving closer to the bed where a forensic technician was already dusting for fingerprints. The mattress was so saturated with blood it was almost black in some places. On one of the pillows, he could clearly see the perfect bloody imprint of a hand. He figured it had to belong to either Bonnie or her attacker. They would have to wait for the lab results to know for sure. Faust stepped back to get a wider view of the room. He noticed that the bed sheets had been partially pulled off the bed and were bunched up in a ball in the middle of the blood-soaked mattress. To him, the scene screamed of a long, violent struggle. It looked like the attack had started while Bonnie was in bed, and that most of the violence had happened right there. He also saw a folding knife with a bright red handle lying on the mattress. Nearby, a purse had been emptied out. Multiple credit cards and a checkbook were scattered across the bed. The fact that these valuable items were left behind made Faust think that robbery probably wasn't the motive for whatever had happened to Bonnie. Then, something small on the floor by the bed caught his eye. After checking with the photographer to make sure the area had already been documented, Faust put on a pair of latex gloves, crouched down, and carefully picked it up. It was a small, brown button. He took it over to the closet and started going through the clothes hanging inside, but the button didn't seem to match anything that belonged to Bonnie. Based on where he found it, Faust theorized that the button must have been torn off someone's clothing during the struggle. It could have come from the clothes Bonnie was wearing, or it could have come from her attacker. Faust gave the button to a forensics officer and told him to bag it as evidence. He continued to scan the room. Amidst all the chaotic blood spatter, he noticed a distinct trail of red droplets snaking across the carpet. The trail led directly to a sliding glass door that opened into the backyard. He went over and tried the handle. It was unlocked. The forensics officer working in the room confirmed that no one from their team had touched that door all morning. It must have been left unlocked by the killer. Faust slid the door open and stepped out into the backyard. He followed the trail of blood droplets across the grass, all the way to a side door that led into the garage. He noted that there were no drag marks in the grass. This suggested that Bonnie's attacker hadn't dragged her out of the house. They had carried her. This implied the attacker was likely bigger and stronger than Bonnie. But then, looking at the family photos again, Faust could see that Bonnie was a very petite woman. That didn't really narrow down the list of suspects very much. Many people could have been strong enough to carry her. Faust reached the door to the garage and turned the knob. It was also unlocked. He pushed it open and looked inside. The garage was empty, there was no car, but the trail of blood clearly continued a few feet inside before it stopped. The picture was becoming clearer in Faust's mind. The suspect had carried Bonnie from her bedroom through the backyard and into this garage. They had then loaded her into the car that was normally parked here, and they had driven away with her. Faust knew that his best chance of finding Bonnie now was to identify the missing car and put out an alert for it. Once he had finished his initial survey of the crime scene, Faust went back outside. He found Bonnie's two younger children, Candace and Brandon, still sitting on the curb. He crouched down next to them. They were both still visibly shaken, their eyes wide with a mixture of terror and confusion. Faust, in a very gentle voice, asked them to tell him about the last time they had seen their mother. Candace spoke up first. She said the last time she actually saw her was around 11:45 the night before, when their mom had said goodnight and gone to bed. But, she added, around 3:00 the morning, she and Brandon were still up watching TV when their mom had yelled from her bedroom for them to turn it off and go to sleep. She said that after their mom yelled, they got up, turned off the TV, and went to their own rooms. Both kids insisted that they didn't hear or see anything else unusual until they woke up that morning and made the horrific discovery in their mother's bedroom. This timeline gave Faust something to work with. If the kids were telling the truth, then Bonnie must have disappeared sometime after 3 a.m. It also suggested something else about the killer. If the suspect was able to get in through the sliding glass door in Bonnie's bedroom, attack her, find her car keys, and then carry her out to the garage and drive away, all without waking anyone else in the house, it strongly suggested that this person was familiar with the layout of the house. They had probably been there before. This might be someone the family knew. Faust then pointed to the bloodstains on Candace and Brandon's shirts and asked them how they got there. Candace admitted that before they called 911, she and her brother had gone into the bedroom and desperately searched for their mom, hoping she was just hurt and hiding somewhere. In their frantic search, they had gotten blood on their clothes. Faust understood. They were just kids, terrified and looking for their mother. But he also knew, with a sinking feeling, that this meant his primary crime scene was now contaminated. The kids had likely touched multiple surfaces, moved things around, and inadvertently destroyed or obscured potential evidence. But he didn't say any of this to them. He just calmly told them to go inside, change their clothes, and give the bloody clothes to one of the forensics technicians. He also instructed them to stay far away from their mother's bedroom. Candace nodded, stood up, and took her little brother by the hand. As they walked back toward the house, another sheriff's deputy approached Faust. The deputy told him there was someone else he needed to talk to. Bonnie had another child, a 15-year-old son named Bradley. That evening, Detective Faust walked down the sterile hallway of the Pima County Juvenile Court Center, a file folder tucked under his arm. He opened the door to a small, windowless office. A teenage boy was already sitting inside, waiting for him. Faust recognized him from the mugshot in the file. It was Bradley Sanborn, Bonnie's oldest son. Faust walked in and sat down across from him. As gently as he could, he broke the news to Bradley that his mother was missing. He explained that based on the evidence they found in her bedroom, it appeared she had been viciously attacked, kidnapped, and that there was a very real possibility she was no longer alive. Faust knew that Bradley couldn't have physically been the one to attack his mother. He had a rock-solid alibi, being locked up in this very facility at the time of the attack. But Faust had been doing some digging into Bradley's friends. He opened the file folder he was carrying and spread the papers out on the desk in front of Bradley. He began showing Bradley the information he had gathered on his friend, Jason Horbachevsky. Jason was a known gang member, and according to several police informants, he was known for always carrying a knife. There were even stories that he would sometimes pull the knife out and bizarrely stab himself in the side of the head. Faust wondered aloud if the red-handled folding knife they'd found on Bonnie's mattress belonged to Jason. He suggested that maybe the attack on Bonnie was an act of revenge for her calling the police on Jason and Bradley just the day before. But as Faust watched Bradley for a reaction, he saw that the boy's tough exterior had completely crumbled. Tears were streaming down his cheeks, and he choked out that he didn't know anything. He admitted that he and his mom argued a lot, but he swore he would never, ever hurt her. To Faust, Bradley's grief seemed completely genuine. He immediately concluded that if Jason's gang was involved in his mother's disappearance, Bradley was not in on the plan. Asking Bradley more questions seemed like a dead end. Faust decided his next step was to find Jason and talk to him directly. Later that same night, Faust was back at the station, a cold cup of coffee on his desk, sifting through police records on Bradley, Jason, and Jason's gang. After leaving the juvenile center, Faust had immediately sent officers out to find and interview Jason, but it was proving to be much more difficult than he had anticipated. He knew Jason wasn't in custody, but he also wasn't at any of his previously known addresses. He had basically vanished. So Faust had officers fanning out across the city, talking to as many of Jason's known associates and fellow gang members as they could find, hoping someone knew where he was or knew something about Bonnie's disappearance. So far, they had come up empty on both fronts. Just then, the door to Faust's office opened. A deputy poked his head in and told him there was someone in the lobby he should probably talk to. Faust got up, walked out to the front lobby, and was surprised to see Jason Horbachevsky sitting there, waiting for him. When Jason saw Faust, he stood up, a cocky, confident smirk on his face. He told Faust that he'd heard the sheriff's department was looking for him, and he was there to show them he had nothing to hide. Faust didn't even bother asking him where he had been. He just led him straight back to an interrogation room. As they sat down at the table across from each other, Faust's eyes were immediately drawn to the buttons on Jason's shirt. They were small and brown, just like the one he had found on the floor of Bonnie's bedroom. And as he looked closer, he saw that a few of the buttons on the shirt were missing. Faust felt a jolt of excitement, but he kept his expression neutral. He decided not to ask about the button just yet. He didn't want to show his hand too early. Instead, he started the interview with standard questions, asking Jason about his friendship with Bradley, his relationship with Bonnie, and his whereabouts on the night of the attack. Jason admitted that he was angry at Bonnie for calling the cops on them, but he denied having any plan for revenge. He insisted he had no idea where Bonnie was or what had happened to her. He claimed he had been at home, asleep, on the night she was attacked. At the end of the interview, he readily agreed to give Faust a DNA sample. He even took off his shirt with the missing brown buttons and turned it over for forensic analysis. After that, Faust let Jason go. He had a strong feeling he had his man, but he would have to wait for the lab to confirm it. The next morning, Sunday, December 10th, Faust was back in his office, organizing the mountain of information his team had collected over the past 24 hours. While he had been dealing with Bradley and Jason, other detectives had been re-interviewing Bonnie's friends, family, and neighbors. But so far, no one had any useful information. A few neighbors had confirmed that the Sanborns were a troubled family, but beyond that, they all said Bonnie was a nice person, and they couldn't imagine who would want to hurt her. Faust was reading through the interview transcripts, searching for any small clue he might have missed, when his office phone rang. He picked it up. The man on the other end of the line sounded panicked. He said he had a tip about the Bonnie Sanborn case. The man explained that earlier that morning he had seen a news report about Bonnie's disappearance. The report had mentioned that police were looking for her car, a light blue Chrysler. The man said that just the day before, he and his wife had been out for a run and had passed a car exactly like that. It was abandoned on the side of a dirt road in the desert just outside of town. He said at the time they hadn't gotten too close to it and hadn't really thought anything of it. But after seeing the news report, he and his wife had driven back out to the desert to see if the car was still there. He said not only was it still there, but when they got up close and looked in the window, they could see what looked like a woman's body in the back seat. Faust immediately wrote down the location. When he checked it on a map, he realized the spot was only about a half a mile from Bonnie's house. He thanked the man for calling, hung up the phone, and raced out to his car. He drove out past the edge of town into the open desert, and sure enough, up ahead, he saw a light blue Chrysler parked in the sand. He pulled his own car over, got out, and cautiously approached the Chrysler. He peered through the back window, and his heart sank. He saw a woman's body slumped over in the back seat. It was Bonnie. He had been holding out hope, but seeing her there, dead in such a brutal and undignified way, was just heartbreaking. Faust walked back to his car and radioed for the forensics team. Once they arrived and began processing the new scene, he went back over to the Chrysler to examine the body more closely. He put on a fresh pair of gloves and leaned into the car. He gently lifted Bonnie's head and saw that there were multiple severe wounds all over her skull, as if she had been repeatedly struck with a sharp, heavy object. Her partial nudity also made it clear that a sexual assault had likely occurred. There were also numerous defensive wounds on her hands and forearms, clear evidence that she had fought back hard against her killer. One of the forensics officers pulled out a black light and began scanning the back seat of the car for biological evidence. As he ran the light over Bonnie's leg, a spot on her skin lit up brightly. The officer told Faust that it was almost certainly the killer's semen. He carefully took a swab of the area, placed it in an evidence bag, and told Faust that within a few weeks, they should have a full DNA profile of their killer. In the meantime, the fingerprints that had been lifted from Bonnie's bedroom were analyzed, and the results came back with a match that surprised everyone, especially Detective Faust. All of the prints, including the bloody handprint on the pillow, belonged to Bonnie's 13-year-old daughter, Candace. As much as Faust didn't want to believe that a young girl could be involved in a plot to murder her own mother, he now had to seriously consider it. Not just because of the prints, but because of the well-documented history of problems within the Sanborn family. He knew Candace couldn't have committed this crime on her own, but it was possible she had helped whoever did. Faust brought Candace in for questioning again. When he confronted her with the fingerprint evidence, she completely broke down, sobbing uncontrollably. She insisted again that she had just been scared and confused, that she had gone into the room looking for her mom and hadn't realized she was touching everything and leaving her prints all over the place. Looking at the terrified teenager, Faust's gut told him she wasn't involved. She just seemed like a scared kid who had stumbled into a nightmare. But he was still convinced that Bonnie's killer had to be someone who knew her personally, someone who had been in her house before. And that left one major person of interest who had not yet been ruled out, Bonnie's husband, Robert. Later that day, Faust was sitting at his desk, the phone pressed to his ear, listening to terrible hold music. On his desk was a handwritten list of airline names and flight numbers. Bonnie's husband, Robert, was supposed to have been in Maryland on the weekend his wife was killed. But just because he said he was there didn't mean it was true. Faust knew there were multiple flights that Robert could have secretly taken from Maryland back to Tucson, giving him a window of opportunity to commit the murder and then fly back to work in time for his next shift. So Faust had compiled a list of every possible flight Robert could have taken, and he was now painstakingly calling each airline one by one to check the passenger manifests. So far, he had struck out. Robert Sanborn's name hadn't appeared on any of the flights he had checked. He was now on hold with the very last airline on his list. Just then, the music cut out, and an airline representative came on the line. She told Faust that she had triple-checked her records, and there was no Robert Sanborn on that flight either. He thanked her and hung up the phone with a sigh. He knew this didn't completely clear Robert. This was before 9/11, and air travel security was much more lax back then. It was possible for someone to fly on a domestic flight without even showing an ID. Robert could have easily traveled under a fake name. But there was one more step he could take. He would ask Robert for a DNA sample. When the lab results came back for the sample found on Bonnie's body, he would have a definitive answer. One morning in early January of 1996, about a month after Bonnie's murder, Faust's office phone rang. It was a technician from the crime lab on the other end. In the weeks since Bonnie's body was found, 5 more murders had occurred in the Tucson area, and Faust and his team were stretched to their breaking point. So when the lab tech said he had results in the Bonnie Sanborn case, it took Faust a moment to remember which case he was talking about. But once he did, he sat up straight at his desk and grabbed a pen. He held his breath as the lab tech delivered the news. The DNA from the sample found on Bonnie's leg was not a match for her husband Robert. Nor was it a match for her son's friend, Jason Horbachevsky. The lab also confirmed that the brown buttons from Jason's shirt were not a match for the button found in Bonnie's bedroom. It was just a bizarre coincidence. Faust was deeply disappointed. He had really thought Jason was their guy. But he wasn't going to give up. He asked the lab tech to run the killer's DNA profile against the state's database of convicted sex offenders to see if they could get a match there. But as the weeks turned into months, the crime lab kept calling with the same update, no match. The investigation stalled. Faust was pulled off to work on other, more active cases. By the summer of 1996, it was looking like Bonnie Sanborn's murder was going to go cold. And then, after 9 long months with no progress, an anonymous tip came in. That September, Detective Faust sat in an interrogation room at the sheriff's department across a small table from a 40-year-old drug dealer named Lyle Winstead. The anonymous tipster had claimed that Lyle sold drugs in Bonnie's neighborhood and that he had been saying some very suspicious things about the case. When Faust had looked into Lyle's background, he found that he had a history of violent crimes, many of them involving knives. Now, sitting in the interrogation room, Lyle was visibly nervous, constantly shifting in his chair, his eyes darting around the room. When Faust started asking him questions about Bonnie's murder, Lyle began making strange excuses for the killer. He said that maybe the killer wasn't such a bad guy, that maybe he was just, in Lyle's words, on a bad trip. Faust found his behavior incredibly suspicious. He asked Lyle for a DNA sample, and Lyle agreed. Faust sent the sample off to the crime lab and then had to endure another several weeks of waiting for the results. When they finally came in, it was another dead end. Lyle Winstead was not a match. At this point, Faust was beyond frustrated. They had put so much time and effort into this case with absolutely nothing to show for it. He didn't want to see Bonnie's file get put back on the shelf to gather dust. He decided to go back to the very beginning, to re-examine every single piece of evidence, every interview, to make sure he hadn't missed something. The next month, in between working his other cases, Faust found the time to go door to door through Bonnie's neighborhood and re-interview every single person his team had already spoken to almost a year earlier. He knew how gossip and rumors could spread in a tight-knit community like this one. Even though no one had been able to offer any solid leads the first time around, he wondered if maybe some new information might have surfaced in the months since the murder. So he knocked on one door after another, patiently asking the same questions over and over again. And eventually, at a house just down the street from Bonnie's, a woman told him something. She said she didn't know anything herself, but there was a rumor circulating in the neighborhood that he might want to look into. Faust listened intently. And after so many frustrating false starts and dead ends, it was this small neighborhood rumor that would finally allow him to solve the case. Based on that rumor, and the DNA and other evidence that was later uncovered, this is what police believe happened to Bonnie Sanborn on the night of the 9th of December 1995. Around 2:30 in the morning, her killer was watching her house from a hiding spot across the street. The killer knew the Sanborns were planning to move to Maryland, and he felt a strange sense of urgency, like there was something he had to do before they left. Around 3 a.m., the killer saw the light in Bonnie's living room finally go dark. A few moments later, he saw some movement behind the curtains in one of the bedroom windows, and then that light went out too, plunging the entire house into darkness. This was the moment he had been waiting for. He wanted to make sure that not just Bonnie, but her children were asleep before he went inside. Confident that the coast was clear, the killer grabbed his tools, a set of flex ties and a chipping hammer. A chipping hammer is a specific type of tool used by welders, with a normal hammer face on one side and a sharp, pointed pick on the other. Carrying this brutal weapon, he crept across the street, through Bonnie's backyard, and right up to the sliding glass door at the back of the house. He knew from past experience that the family often left it unlocked. He was right. The door slid open without a sound. He knew that this door led directly into Bonnie's bedroom. After sliding the door open, the killer stepped inside. He saw Bonnie in her bed, asleep under the covers, began to move toward her, but as he stepped closer, a floorboard creaked loudly under his weight. Bonnie stirred in her sleep. She rolled over and looked in the direction of the sound. Her eyes met the killer's in the darkness. He knew he had lost the element of surprise. He had to act. No. He lunged at the bed. Bonnie tried to fight back, but it was no use. The kill element was too strong and completely overpowered her, striking her repeatedly with the hammer. Once Bonnie stopped struggling, but while she was still alive, the killer used the flex ties to bind her hands tightly behind her back. Then, as she lay helpless and bleeding on the bed, he frantically searched the room for her purse. When he found it, he dumped its contents out onto the bed until he found what he was looking for, her car keys. He grabbed the keys, and then he picked up Bonnie's still-living body, carried her back out through the sliding glass door, across the backyard, and into the garage. There, he used her keys to unlock her blue Chrysler. He put Bonnie in the back seat, then he got into the driver's seat and drove out into the desert, parking on the side of a quiet, deserted road. When the killer was finished with Bonnie, he simply got out of the car, left her there, and began the short walk back into town. As the sun began to rise, the killer casually walked right back down Bonnie's street, back to his own house, just a few doors down. It turned out that Detective Faust had been so focused on suspects within Bonnie's immediate circle of family and friends that he had overlooked the person who was, quite literally, the closest to her. Her across-the-street neighbor, 22-year-old Freddie Royval. Freddie and his father had done some repair work at Bonnie's house in the past, so he was familiar with the layout. The rumor that the neighbor had told Faust was that Freddie had a crush on Bonnie, that he found her attractive. Another rumor was also circulating about a woman in the neighborhood being assaulted by a younger man, and some people suspected it was Freddie. It wasn't much to go on, but it was all Faust had. So police made the decision to collect DNA samples from every young man living on that block. And when the results came back, Freddie Royval's DNA was a perfect match to the sample found on Bonnie's body. Freddie Royval was arrested in January of 1997, a little over a year after he murdered Bonnie Sanborn. He was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison. But for the people who lived on that quiet Tucson street, the most disturbing part of the case was never just the brutality of the murder itself. It was the realization that Bonnie's killer had been there the entire time. Watching from across the street, walking past her house, blending into the neighborhood like nothing was wrong. And while Bonnie spent her final months worrying about the dangers inside her own home, the real threat had been waiting just outside of it all along. One day in January of 2018, a police officer was making his way through a quiet patch of woods near the small town of Gray in France. And as he walked, his eyes were fixed on the ground because he was following a literal trail of blood. This trail eventually led the officer to the body of a person who had very clearly been shot in the head. Now, at first glance, this had all the markings of a suicide, but the officer had some serious questions. This was not the first body that had been found in these same woods. Another one had been discovered just a couple of months earlier, and it was starting to feel like there was a very disturbing pattern forming here. At around 5 in the evening on the 27th of October 2017, a 29-year-old woman named Alexia Duval was driving her car down a cul-de-sac in that same small, quiet town of Gray. She was on her way to her parents' house to celebrate her nephew's second birthday. It was supposed to be a big family get-together. Her sister, her brother-in-law, and her little nephew had all driven in from Paris, which was about a 4-hour drive away, just for this celebration. But as Alexia drove, she had to admit to herself that she had very mixed feelings about seeing everyone tonight. You see, Alexia had been going through a really difficult time recently. She and her husband of 13 years, Jonathan, had been trying to get pregnant for a while. She had gone through several rounds of fertility treatments, and the process had thrown her hormones completely out of whack. It seemed to affect her a lot more intensely than it did for most women who went through it. And then, after all of that struggle, she had finally gotten pregnant. But just a couple of months ago, she had tragically suffered a miscarriage. So, even though Alexia absolutely adored her sister's family and got along with them wonderfully, the pain of her miscarriage was still very raw. She just knew it was going to be incredibly difficult for her to be around her young nephew. He was a constant, innocent reminder of the baby she had lost. Alexia's car came to a stop outside a gated driveway at the end of the cul-de-sac. She pushed the button on the intercom, and a moment later, the gate swung open. She drove up the long driveway toward a beautiful house with a perfectly kept garden out front. She parked her car in the driveway, right behind her father's white van, and then she got out. She reached into the back seat and grabbed a wrapped present along with a couple of desserts she baked herself. She carried them up to the front door of the house and rang the doorbell. A few seconds later, the door opened, and her mother, Isabel Fuyo, stood there with a huge smile on her face. She welcomed Alexia inside and led her into the dining room. Alexia's father, Jean-Pierre, was sitting at the table, deep in conversation with Alexia's brother-in-law, Gregory, and her sister, Stephanie. They all stood up and greeted her with warm hugs. As Alexia started to explain that her husband, Jonathan, was running late and would be there later in a separate car because a job he was on as an electrician had run long, she heard the sound of little feet pattering towards her. A moment later, her 2-year-old nephew, James, ran around the corner and threw his little arms around Alexia's legs. To her own surprise and immense relief, Alexia didn't feel that familiar pang of sadness. All she felt was a wave of pure happiness. She bent down and scooped the little boy up into her arms, giving him a big, warm hug. Then she handed him his birthday present. Eventually, the whole family settled in for dinner. And for a while, all of Alexia's worries and sadness just seemed to melt away. She was incredibly close with everyone at that table, especially her mother and her sister, Stephanie. Just being around them always had a way of lifting her spirits. Alexia's husband, Jonathan, finally arrived sometime around 8:30 that evening. He joined the family, and along with everyone else, he had a wonderful night. They ate, they drank, and they just chatted and laughed together. After dinner was all cleaned up, Alexia's father decided to head to bed, but everyone else stayed up. They all just continued to have this really nice, comfortable time together until around 11 o'clock when Alexia announced that it was probably time for her and Jonathan to head home. They both had early mornings ahead of them. Jonathan had some errands to run, and Alexia was hoping to get a workout in before starting her day. A few minutes later, on the drive home, Alexia sat in the passenger seat of Jonathan's car. She had left her own car back at her parents' house because she had been drinking wine with dinner, and she was planning to just pick it up when they came back the next day. Alexia and Jonathan's house was located on a quiet residential street only about a mile away from her parents' place. And as they drove down their road, Alexia glanced out the window at a particular house just up the street from where they lived. And as she looked at it, her expression soured. The neighbor who lived in that house had an adult grandson who had been harassing Alexia all summer long. He had become obsessed with her and would call and text her constantly, to the point where Alexia didn't even feel safe going out for a jog by herself around their own neighborhood. Fortunately, the harassment had stopped a couple of months ago, but only because the man had been committed to a mental hospital. But Alexia didn't know how long he would be there. She didn't know if he had already been released. So it felt more like a temporary pause than a real, long-term solution. But on this night at least, there was nobody peering out at her from the neighbor's window. A minute later, their car pulled into their garage, and Alexia and Jonathan got out. As Alexia walked from the garage into the main house, she passed by a treadmill that sat in the corner of the garage. It had broken down a few weeks ago. She asked Jonathan if he'd gotten around to fixing it yet, and he told her no, he hadn't. Alexia just sighed. The weather forecast for the next day was supposed to be very cold and gloomy. It looked like she was going to have to go for her run outside after all. The following morning, around 11 o'clock, Jonathan walked up to the front door of Alexia's parents' house and rang the doorbell. As he waited, he cast a worried look over his shoulder at Alexia's car, which was still parked right where they had left it the night before. Jonathan took a deep breath and tried to hide how anxious he was feeling as Alexia's mother, Isabel, answered the door. Then, in a very shaky voice, Jonathan said hello and asked her if she had seen or heard from her daughter recently. When Isabel said she hadn't, Jonathan completely lost his composure. He told her that Alexia had gone out for a jog that morning, but she hadn't come back, and now he was starting to get really worried. He explained that he had tried texting Alexia, but she still hadn't answered. By this point, she should have been home a long, long time ago. Something was wrong. A moment later, Jonathan saw Stephanie and Gregory coming out of the guest room. They had very concerned looks on their faces. They joined Jonathan and Isabel at the front door and asked what all the commotion was about. So, Jonathan frantically re-explained the situation. He asked if either of them had heard from Alexia in the last hour or so, but they both shook their heads and said they hadn't. Stephanie did show Jonathan that she had received a text from Alexia at 9:30 that morning, just saying that she was going out for this jog. But after that, none of them had received any texts or calls from her. Jonathan was openly crying by this point. Alexia's family tried to assure him that everything was probably fine. They told him Alexia would probably just show up at the house any minute now, that she was likely just running late. Jonathan wanted to believe them, but this was completely out of character for Alexia. It was not normal for her to be gone for this long without being in touch with anyone. It just didn't make any sense. It was at this point that his brother-in-law, Gregory, reached out and put a comforting hand on Jonathan's shoulder. He just said, "Look, if it makes you feel any better, I'll go back with you. We can go look for Alexia together, or at least we can be together until she comes back." Jonathan didn't really know what to do, but he was very thankful for the offer and said yes, that would be great. A couple of minutes later, the two men got into Gregory's SUV and they began driving back towards their house. But Jonathan had Gregory drive through the streets along the running route that Alexia usually took to see if maybe they could spot her. They drove down all the side streets, scanning for any sign of her. When they reached the edge of town, Jonathan and Gregory got out of the car and started checking the paths that led into the countryside. They also checked the ditches and the banks of the nearby river. But they didn't find Alexia anywhere. Eventually, they just drove back to Jonathan and Alexia's house, hoping that maybe she had finally come home with an explanation for all of this. But she hadn't. At this point, Jonathan was completely beside himself with worry. Gregory, doing his best to stay calm for both of them, suggested that they go to the hospital and see if Alexia had turned up there. A few minutes later, when they stopped in the parking lot of the local hospital, Jonathan jumped out of the car and ran towards the main entrance. Two nurses were standing outside taking a cigarette break. Jonathan rushed up to them and told them that he was looking for his wife, that she had gone on a run 3 hours ago and no one knew where she was now, and maybe, just maybe, she was here. The nurses could clearly see this was an emergency. They put out their cigarettes and went back inside to check the hospital's register. But a minute later, they came back out and told the men that no, and Alexia Duvall had not been admitted that morning. She wasn't there. Before Jonathan or Gregory could protest or ask more questions, the nurses just looked at them and said, "Look, you need to go to the police." Later that afternoon, a police officer named Adeline Pagney sat across from Jonathan in a small room at the Gray police station. He explained to her what had happened, that his wife was missing. Jonathan also gave a description of what Alexia had been wearing when she went out running: bright pink shoes, black leggings, and a red jacket. It would have been pretty easy to spot. And then, after describing her and sort of realizing the full weight of why he was there, he just put his head in his hands and continued to weep, just as he had been doing for much of the morning. Now, Officer Pagney could obviously tell that Jonathan was very upset, but she had to ask the question that was already forming in her mind. So, as delicately as possible, she asked Jonathan if his wife had any suicidal tendencies, or any reason at all she might have run off without telling anybody. Jonathan looked up really quickly and just shook his head, no. He said that overall his wife was a very happy person and was definitely not suicidal. However, as he sat there thinking about it, he added that she had been taking hormones for her fertility treatments, and realistically, those hormones appeared to have affected her really badly. For example, he said that sometimes she would lose control of her emotions entirely and even become violent. In other instances, he said that she would even have memory lapses where she wouldn't even know what she was doing while she was doing it. It was like she had become this completely different person. Officer Pagney nodded and just listened to Jonathan, writing down everything he was saying. When he was done, she followed up and asked, "Can you think of anybody who might have had a problem with Alexia?" For a moment, Jonathan just sat there in silence, kind of mulling over the question. And then suddenly, his eyes went wide, like he had just realized something. He told the officer that they had a neighbor who had been completely obsessed with Alexia earlier that year. He said his name was Arno, and he had been obsessively calling and texting her so many times that Alexia had actually had to block his number. She had even talked about how she was fearful of going out alone because of this neighbor. But just a couple of months earlier, he had been sent to a psychiatric hospital, and because he was literally removed from the neighborhood, the harassment had stopped. But Jonathan said they were kind of worried that at some point he would come back, and then he would be a problem again. And realistically, Jonathan said he could be home now. I just don't know. I don't know where he is. Officer Pagney was obviously very intrigued by this information. So, after this interview with Jonathan was over, she and her investigative team began digging into this Arno guy to see where he was and what was going on with him. And pretty quickly they discovered that while Arno had gone to that psychiatric hospital, that was true. He was not there anymore. He had been released. And so that night, another officer with the Grey Police knocked on the door of Arno's mother's house, where Arno was staying, which was about an hour away from Alexia and Jonathan's house. After the officer knocked, a middle-aged woman answered the door. When the officer asked if she was Arno's mother, she said she was. The officer looked past her, and he could see a disheveled-looking young man sitting right inside. He asked the mother if that was Arno, and again the woman said yes. At this point, the officer asked the mother if he could come inside because he said he needed to speak privately with her son. The mother and Arno in the background both seemed very confused by this, but after a minute they both agreed and the officer came inside. The officer went into the house and sat down in the living room with Arno, while Arno's mother went to the kitchen to give them some privacy. Once the mother was gone, the officer looked at Arno and just said he had some questions about Alexia Duvall. Arno immediately looked down at this question like he was embarrassed and couldn't even look at the officer. But then he looked back up again and told the officer that he had bipolar disorder. He explained that sometimes when he was in a manic state, he acted inappropriately towards women, and that included Alexia. The officer followed up about all those messages that Arno had apparently sent to Alexia that summer. What was going on with that? Arno admitted that he had done that, but he insisted it really was no big deal. He said that he and Alexia knew each other because they had been neighbors at one point, and they had also hung out in a group setting once. So him being in touch with her was not totally weird, he claimed. They had a real connection. But Arno clarified that when Alexia told him to stop contacting her, he did. And that was the end of it. But this caught the officer's attention because according to Alexia's husband, Jonathan, the only reason that all the calls and texts had stopped was because Alexia literally had to block Arno's phone number. So, the officer just cut to the chase here and told Arno that Alexia was missing. And then, before Arno could say anything, the officer asked him where he had been that morning at 9 o'clock. And Arno said, I was right here. I was at home with my mom. For a moment, the officer just stared at Arno, trying to read his body language to see if maybe he was being deceptive. So, eventually, the officer just stood up and went into the kitchen where the mother was. And he asked the mother, "Where was your son this morning?" And she told the officer, with a sort of bewildered look on her face, that he was here with her all morning. So at this point, it was clear to the officer that if the mother was telling the truth, it would officially rule out Arno as a suspect because he had a solid alibi. But the officer also knew that, generally speaking, mothers do not make the best alibis. Mothers are known to lie, cheat, and do just about anything to protect their kids. The following afternoon, on Sunday, October 29th, Chief Officer Frank Pettis glanced out his office window as yet another news van sped past outside, down the usually quiet streets of Gray. By now, Alexia's disappearance had blown up into this huge national news story, and this was making it really difficult for Pettis, who was in charge of the investigation. It was still very early in the investigation, but already he and his investigators were being hounded by reporters and camera crews at every single step. Pettis closed his eyes and tried to focus on what his next step should be. The search effort was well underway. They had called in reinforcements from nearby towns and even organized search teams with volunteers from the public. At that very moment, law enforcement was also using drones and dogs to scour the town and all the surrounding woods. Pettis's investigation team had also searched Jonathan and Alexia's home by now, secretly hoping they might find something to pin the disappearance on Jonathan, but there was no blood, no sign of a struggle, and no clues that gave them any direction there. And also, all of Alexia's other family members, her parents, her sister Stephanie, and her brother-in-law Gregory, they could all vouch for each other's whereabouts on the morning of Alexia's disappearance. They all claimed they had been at the house together. And so, without any real leads, Pettis had gotten so desperate for any information that he had literally told his team to set up checkpoints out in the streets and just stop random people and ask them if they had seen or heard anything that could help them find Alexia. And now, as Pettis sat in his office wondering what he was going to do today, he heard a knock at his door. A moment later, one of his investigators entered with fairly surprising news. The checkpoints had actually turned up something. Pettis listened intently as the investigator explained that a number of people he had spoken to had mentioned a van. Now, no one had actually seen the van themselves, but they all appeared to have heard the same rumor. Apparently, there was a man driving around the area in this white van, and he was known to harass girls and women right out on the street. Now, at first glance, Pettis was worried that perhaps this was just an unfounded rumor. But then he remembered there were actually two men in Alexia's family who literally drove white vans. Her father, Jean-Pierre, he owned one. And her husband, Jonathan, he drove one for work. On the afternoon of Monday, October 30th, a little more than 2 days after Alexia went missing, Pettis brought his car to a stop next to a news van that was parked in the middle of the woods, about 4 miles outside of town. Minutes ago, he had received a call from an officer in the field telling him that Alexia's body had been found. And so, Pettis had driven out to the scene as fast as he could. But now that he was here at the crime scene, he could tell that he was late to the game because a news crew was already there, setting up their cameras near a row of police barriers. Pettis was disappointed to see this, because he had hoped that if and when her body was discovered dead, he would have had at least one suspect, or hopefully multiple suspects, identified and under surveillance before the word got out to the general public that Alexia was found dead. But now, he obviously would not get that chance. Pettis climbed out of his car and flashed his badge to an officer who led him around the barriers and into the crime scene. He went over to one of the forensics experts who was taking photos and placing yellow numbered markers on the ground, and Pettis introduced himself as the lead investigator. The expert then led him over to Alexia's body, which was lying on the ground between 2 tree trunks covered by a white bedsheet. Her pink running shoes were poking out from under the sheet, and Pettis noticed that her feet and the sheet were both partially burned, as if someone had tried to set them on fire at some point. Once the scene had been fully photographed, Pettis bent down and lifted the sheet to get a better look at Alexia's body. She was lying on her back, and there were bruises all over her face. There were also marks on her neck that looked like they were from strangulation. And right away, Pettis noticed a couple of things that were very unusual. First, Alexia's hands were placed neatly in the pockets of her coat, as though her body had been placed there on the ground with a lot of care. Second, despite the beating that Alexia's face had apparently taken, her glasses were placed perfectly on her face, and so to Pettis, it seemed like whoever killed Alexia had felt some sort of remorse afterwards. It was as though the killer had committed this incredibly violent murder, but then had tried to kind of put everything back in order afterward. And this made Pettis think that Alexia's killer was very likely someone who knew Alexia, and not a stranger who simply accosted her during a jog. Just then, he heard his name called, and he stood up to take a look. Nearby, there was a forensics tech that was waving him over. So, Pettis walked over, and the tech showed him what he'd found. It was a gray plastic cap that looked like it belonged on some kind of spray can. Pettis thought that maybe this could help explain the strange burn marks on the bedsheet and also on Alexia's shoes. The killer had probably sprayed something on the body to try and help it catch fire, but it didn't work as well as they thought it would. Just then, another forensics tech called Pettis over to them to show him something else. They had found tire tracks in the dirt. Pettis immediately thought about that tip he had been given about this van with a person driving around town harassing women and girls. And he wondered if maybe that was true, that this van was involved, and that these tracks had been left by the killer when they were transporting Alexia's body. So, as this forensics expert began taking photographs of the tire tracks, Pettis made a mental note to examine the tires of every suspect, family member, and other person of interest they came across, just in case one of them was a match. Pettis was about to turn his attention back to the body when he noticed one more unusual thing out in the woods. There was this young man who did not appear to be a reporter, just kind of wandering around out there in the trees, almost lurking near the crime scene. So immediately, Pettis went over to this guy and demanded to know what he was doing there. And at this, the man went completely wide-eyed and just started stuttering, like he was totally caught off guard. Eventually, the guy managed to mumble that he was just out there picking mushrooms. But Pettis could tell he was obviously lying. That was not why he was out there. And so, operating on a gut instinct, Pettis pulled out his handcuffs and placed the man under arrest. Later that same afternoon, just hours after Alexia's body had been discovered in the woods, Pettis sat down at a table at the Gray police station across from this suspicious young man he had just arrested for lurking near the crime scene. And Pettis was pleased. I mean, he had only been in charge of what was now a murder investigation for a couple of hours, and here he was about to speak to a legitimate suspect, really the first suspect who was in custody. But as soon as Pettis actually began speaking to this suspect, he realized that the young man's stutter was not really a sign of him being nervous. He actually had speech issues, and he struggled to speak at all, even when he wasn't nervous. The man was eventually able to explain that his name was Anthony, and he was 29 years old. He said he lived with his parents in Apremont, another small town about 5 miles away. And he admitted that he had lied about being there to pick mushrooms. So, Pettis pressed Anthony to explain why he was really there. And Anthony, he seemed a little embarrassed as he began to explain. But what he said was, he didn't know Alexia personally. He had just heard about her disappearance in the news, and he wanted to help with the search effort. But Anthony said he couldn't read or write, so he hadn't been able to fill out the paperwork to join the official search party. So instead, he had just driven out to the woods in his own car to look for Alexia himself. But while he was out there, the police showed up, and clearly there was something going on. And Anthony said he got scared and just lied, and said he was out there picking mushrooms. He said it was just out of embarrassment. As Pettis sat there listening to the story, he wasn't quite sure what to make of it, or really what to make of Anthony. Anthony's demeanor seemed almost childlike, but his behavior was not childlike. It was very adult-like and pretty suspicious. So Pettis followed up by asking him what he was doing on the morning of October 28th, which was the morning Alexia went missing. Anthony said he had woken up at his parents' house and had breakfast with them before he went out with his girlfriend and also another friend. And he gave Pettis their names and also their phone numbers so they could confirm it. So Pettis stepped out of the room, and he did exactly that. He called the various phone numbers and spoke to the people in Anthony's life, and they all corroborated his alibi. So, despite how suspicious Anthony had been acting, Pettis had no choice but to let him go. A week later, on November 5th, a march was organized in Alexia's honor. 10,000 people turned out to show their support for Alexia's family and also to protest violence against women. Hidden among this huge crowd was a pair of police officers who had been assigned to follow Alexia's husband, Jonathan Duvall. At this point, Jonathan really was looking like the most obvious suspect, since he was the husband and also the last person to see Alexia alive. So, the police had tapped his phone and put him under surveillance. But all they had learned so far from the phone taps was that Jonathan made frequent calls to Alexia's family, to his own siblings, and his friends to talk about how much he missed his wife. And the officers who were literally following Jonathan around found that he rarely left his house except to visit Alexia's parents, which he did almost every day. So far, it was like none of Jonathan's behavior actually seemed really suspicious at all. And now, at this big march, the investigators stood in the crowd and watched as Jonathan hobbled his way up the steps to the podium, followed by Alexia's mother and father. In fact, Jonathan was trembling so much by the time he got up there that Alexia's parents had to physically prop him up before he could begin reading his speech to the crowd. And so at this point, the investigators just kind of exchanged a glance. Either they were wasting their time following an obviously grieving husband with nothing to hide, or Jonathan was a world-class actor giving the performance of a lifetime. But the investigators knew that until new evidence presented itself, there was really nothing they could do but watch and wait, which included watching Jonathan and just seeing what he did. They were also still waiting on the tire analysis from the crime scene, but they didn't expect much to come from it. At this point, the creepy white van story seemed to be more like an urban legend in this town. And so, as the weeks turned to months, and still there was no progress on this case, the investigators, including Pettis, began to wonder if this case would ever be solved. But then all of a sudden, new evidence did appear. And when it did, the investigators realized they might have been following the wrong lead this whole time. Because while they had been focused on surveilling Jonathan, a second body had just turned up in the woods outside of Gray. On the evening of Saturday, the 6th of January 2018, Chief Officer Pettis was at his desk, poring over the evidence that had been flooding in all day. The new victim, whose body had been found earlier that same day in the woods, very close to where Alexia's body had been found, was a 38-year-old father of 3. He looked to have died from a gunshot wound to the head. Although, according to the autopsy report, the man had a blood alcohol level of almost 0.4%, which is huge. That can be fatal on its own, or at the very least, knock somebody unconscious. Investigators had found gunpowder on the man's hand, so for now, they were treating his death as a suicide. But the more Pettis looked into the evidence, the less convinced he became that he was looking at a suicide. A gun had been found at the scene, but it had not been located very close to the dead man's body. In fact, the gun was found 130 feet away from the body in a trash can. The only explanation would be that he shot himself, then put the gun in the trash can, and then somehow wandered 130 feet away before collapsing and dying. That was possible, albeit highly unlikely. Being shot in the head is typically immediately incapacitating or lethal, but it is possible he could have shot himself and lived long enough to travel that distance. It just seemed very, very unlikely. So now, Pettis sat back in his chair and just tried to think. It was strange enough to have 2 violent deaths in this same quiet town, let alone to have the bodies be found in basically the exact same spot in the surrounding woods. It just seemed too coincidental not to be looked into. So he had to wonder, maybe there was a connection between this man's death and Alexia's. But later that same month, as Pettis scanned over a document that had just arrived from the crime lab, he wasn't thinking about that second body in the woods anymore. Because this new document in his hands was an expert analysis of those tire tracks that had been found in the woods near Alexia's body. And the analysis showed that there was a tiny defect in the tread of one of the tires. And this defect was so specific that the experts had been able to determine exactly which vehicle left those tracks in the woods. And this vehicle just so happened to be a white van. Pettis felt his pulse quicken as he kept on reading. And a moment later, he reached for his phone and he called his supervisor to tell him the good news. He knew the identity of Alexia's killer. Based on that tire track analysis and also other evidence, including an eventual confession from the killer, this is how police believe Alexia Duvall was killed. The killer was almost blind with rage. They slammed Alexia's head against a nearby wall and then hit her over and over and over again. And then they wrapped their hands around her neck and they squeezed for so long they lost track of time. They were just crushing her neck. And then finally, they couldn't feel her pulse under their fingers anymore. Then, looking down at Alexia's motionless body on the ground, they realized the severity of what they had just done. The killer, in a panic, crouched down next to her and actually tried to wake her up, but it was too late. She was dead. And so, now, they were really panicking. They thought about maybe killing themselves out of guilt, but they were too scared to go through with it. So instead, they hatched a plan to get rid of Alexia's body. The killer very carefully put Alexia's glasses back on her face, and then they lifted her up and they carried her body out to their vehicle. Then they drove out to the woods and dragged her body by the feet to a secluded spot deep in the trees where they hoped nobody would ever find her. They covered Alexia's body in a sheet, and then they sprayed the sheet with this foam that they thought was flammable, hoping that once they lit it on fire, it would help dispose of the body. But when they got their lighter out and held the flame to the sheet, it didn't really work. And so finally, when it was clear they were not going to be able to burn the body here, the killer just left her there and then drove away in their white van, getting home in time to dispose of all the evidence, take a shower, and start the next phase of the cover-up, which was to knock on Alexia's mother's door in a fake panic, asking if anybody had seen her daughter. Because Alexia's killer was her own husband, Jonathan. It turns out Alexia never even went for a run on the morning of October 28th. She was murdered the night before, after she and Jonathan had gotten back from her parents' house. They had gotten into a big fight, which obviously resulted in her death. From the outside, Jonathan and Alexia appeared to be a very happy couple, but in reality, they had been arguing more and more often, primarily because they were not able to have a baby. It was causing a lot of friction in their marriage. And so on the night of October 27th, in the middle of this horrible fight they were having, Jonathan grabbed his keys and tried to leave, but Alexia told him to stop running away from their problems and tried to literally take the keys from him. And according to Jonathan, that's when he just snapped and he killed her. And then he used his work van to dispose of the body. As for that second body that was found in the woods months later, that was determined to be a suicide and completely unrelated to Alexia's death. Jonathan was arrested on the 28th of January 2018. And 2 days after his arrest, he confessed to the murder. At the end of his trial in 2020, he was convicted and sentenced to 25 years in prison. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. The story of Timothy Evans begins long before any crime was committed. In many ways, it began the moment he was born in 1924 in the poor southern region of Wales. Before Timothy even took his first breath, his father had already abandoned the family, leaving his mother alone to raise several children with almost no money. Poverty wasn't something Timothy fell into later in life. It was the world he entered from the very beginning. And almost immediately, life began stacking obstacles in front of him. As a child, Timothy struggled to speak clearly, and once he started school, it became obvious he was falling behind the other students. Even the simplest lessons were difficult for him to understand. Teachers grew frustrated, classmates moved ahead without him, and little by little, Timothy became the kind of child people quietly stopped expecting much from. Then, when he was 8 years old, things became even worse. Timothy developed a painful tuberculosis-related condition on the bottom of his right foot. The disease wasn't killing him, but it made every step feel unbearable. Large blisters formed across the sole of his foot, making it agonizing to walk. For years, he missed huge portions of school, sometimes because he was receiving treatment, and other times because the pain was simply too severe for him to make the walk there at all. For a boy who was already struggling in class, those absences were catastrophic. Years later, psychologists would conclude that Timothy had severe cognitive limitations with an IQ believed to fall somewhere between 60 and 70. And by the time he became one of the most controversial men in British history, his life had already been unraveling for years. Despite all these challenges, Timothy stayed in school as much as he could, but his real focus shifted away from education. He knew his family was desperately poor, and he felt a responsibility to help provide for them. So, he started looking for work. Timothy was willing to do anything for money, no matter how difficult or dangerous the job was. When he was just 13 years old, he became a coal miner, which was, and still is, one of the most dangerous jobs on the planet. But even with his strong work ethic, Timothy could never hold down a job for long. He would always end up getting fired, or he wouldn't get hired in the first place. It was always for the same reasons. Either he'd have a bad flare-up of the tuberculosis on his foot, making it impossible for him to walk to work, or his illiteracy would become a problem. Many jobs simply couldn't employ someone who couldn't read, write, or even speak very clearly. It was a heartbreaking cycle. When he turned 18, World War II was raging, and all his friends were enlisting to go fight. Timothy wanted to join them to do his part, but when he tried to enlist, the military rejected him. They told him they couldn't take him because of his foot and because he was illiterate. This constant rejection and embarrassment took a heavy toll on Timothy. He felt like an outsider, like he didn't belong anywhere. At some point, he developed a coping mechanism. He started to lie. He would invent these grand, elaborate stories about incredible adventures he'd been on, powerful people he knew, and amazing skills he possessed. Most people who knew him didn't believe a word of it, but every once in a while, someone would. And in those brief moments, Timothy would feel a sliver of respect, something he almost never experienced in his real life. Even though it was built on a lie, that feeling was incredible to him, and he became almost addicted to telling these stories. Fast forward to 1947. Timothy was now 23 years old. His family had moved from Wales to London, and they were living in a very poor and rough neighborhood. Timothy had managed to find a job as a delivery driver, and for a while it seemed to be working out. On one of his delivery routes, he met one 8-year-old girl named Beryl Thorley. People who knew Beryl said that she, like Timothy, also had a very low IQ. The two of them met, and they just clicked. They started dating, and by the end of that same year, they were married. At first, they lived in Timothy's family's crowded apartment, but in early 1948, Beryl became pregnant. They decided it was time to get a place of their own. They scraped together what little money they had and rented an apartment. The place was terrible. It was tiny, it was dirty, and it was in an even more dangerous neighborhood than where Timothy's family lived. But for a short time, it was their own, and it was enough. Then, Beryl gave birth to their daughter, Geraldine. Suddenly, the tiny apartment felt impossibly small for a family of 3. Money, which had always been tight, became a massive problem. They just didn't have enough to get by. Timothy desperately tried to find extra work, but he ran into the same old problems. His illiteracy and his recurring foot issue held him back. Before long, Timothy and Beryl were forced to start taking out high-interest loans. They were the kind of loans they knew they could never possibly pay back. They were trapping themselves in a cycle of debt, and the money they borrowed was only enough to keep them in their awful, cramped apartment. It wasn't enough to improve their situation, only to maintain their misery. The weight of the debt, combined with the stress of being new parents in such a tiny space, started to wear down their marriage. It began with constant arguing about money or some other hardship. But soon, it escalated. The arguments turned into full-blown physical fights. They would get so loud that people walking on the busy street 3 floors below could hear them screaming and yelling at each other. Sometimes people would literally stop on the sidewalk and just look up at their window, wondering what was happening up there. As Timothy's world felt like it was crumbling around him, he fell back on his old coping mechanism of lying. He would tell anyone who would listen that he, his wife, and his daughter were doing great, that everything was just fine. But of course, behind closed doors, it was the complete opposite. Lying wasn't enough to dull the pain anymore, so Timothy started drinking heavily. But the alcohol only made everything worse. It gave Beryl another reason to be angry with him, it made him more depressed, and it ate away at the little money they had. Timothy was spiraling, and he felt completely alone. And that's when he found comfort from a very unlikely source, his downstairs neighbor, a man named John Christie. John Christie was the last person you'd expect to become friends with Timothy Evans. He was nearly double Timothy's age, he was incredibly intelligent, and he was a respected member of the community. That respect came from his past. He had served on the front lines during World War I and had nearly died in a mustard gas attack. After the war, he returned to London and became a police constable for several years. After retiring from the police force, he took a quiet job as a post office clerk. But despite all their differences, John and Timothy had one thing in common. They both had experience with marital problems. John and his wife Ethel had gotten married way back in 1920, 4 years before Timothy was even born. Early in their marriage, they had separated and lived apart for many years. But in 1934, they reconciled and moved into the ground floor apartment of the building where Timothy and Beryl would eventually live. So, years later, when John was sitting in his apartment, he could hear the loud, violent fights coming from the third floor. Everyone in the neighborhood could. And John, remembering his own past struggles with his wife, decided he should reach out to the young man upstairs. He thought maybe he could offer some advice, or at the very least, just be a friend. One day, John struck up a conversation with Timothy. Timothy was lonely and had no friends, so he was happy to have someone to talk to. They quickly formed a friendship, but it wasn't a friendship of equals. It was more like a father-son relationship, or a mentor and his student. Timothy, who had never had a father, really looked up to John. And John seemed to look at Timothy with empathy. He could see that Timothy was a young man who wasn't very bright and was completely in over his head with debt, marriage, and a new baby. John tried to guide him and offer him advice on how to navigate this difficult period in his life. This new friendship could have been a very positive thing for Timothy. It might have helped his mental state and maybe even his marriage. But not long after they became friends, Timothy found out that Beryl was pregnant with their second child. This was devastating news. Timothy knew they absolutely could not afford another child. They could barely afford Geraldine. In the United Kingdom at that time, abortions were illegal, so there was no safe or legal way to terminate the pregnancy. Terrified and desperate, Timothy went straight to John for guidance. John would later testify at Timothy's trial about this conversation. He said he did his best to comfort Timothy, telling him everything would be okay, that he'd find more work, that they could take out another loan. But, according to John, his words had no effect. Timothy was beyond consoling. He was desperate and seemed unhinged. John said he started to worry that Timothy might do something drastic to make his problems disappear. And as it turned out, John was right. A few weeks later, on the 30th of November 1949, a disheveled and frantic Timothy Evans walked into a police station in his old hometown in Wales. He walked up to the desk and confessed that he had killed his wife. He told the officers that he had given Beryl a special liquid, a poison that was supposed to abort the fetus. But he said the mixture was too strong and it had killed Beryl by accident. Panicking, Timothy said he took her body and dumped it down a sewer drain right outside their apartment building in London. After that, he arranged for his daughter, Geraldine, to stay with some people he knew, and then he fled to Wales. But once he got there, he said his guilty conscience was too much to bear, and he had to turn himself in. The police in Wales immediately arrested Timothy and transported him back to London. Once he was secured in a London jail cell, detectives went to Timothy's apartment building. They found the manhole cover for the sewer right where Timothy said it would be. But right away, they noticed a problem. They couldn't get the lid off. It was incredibly heavy. One man could barely budge it. It took 3 strong police officers all working together to finally lift the heavy iron lid off the sewer. They peered down into the darkness, but there was no body. There was nothing down there at all. The detectives went back to the jail and confronted Timothy with this fact. They told him his wife wasn't in the sewer. Timothy seemed to squirm for a moment, and then he completely changed his story. He now told the police that it wasn't him who had given Beryl the poison. He said it was his friend, his mentor, the father figure in his life, John Christie. Timothy also told them that he had left his daughter Geraldine in John Christie's care. The police were skeptical of Timothy, but the mention of a missing child made them take his new story seriously. They rushed back to the apartment building and knocked on John Christie's door. John opened the door, with his wife Ethel standing beside him. He seemed completely shocked by the accusations Timothy had made against him. John and Ethel told the police that not only did they have no idea what had happened to Beryl, but Geraldine had never been in their care. The police were now extremely concerned for the little girl's safety. Where was she? Who had her? While they were there, the officers conducted a thorough search of John and Ethel's apartment and the property outside. They didn't find anything suspicious inside the apartment. But then they went outside to the backyard. They had been in this area briefly when they were checking the sewer, but now they did a much more careful search. In the back of the yard, there was a small, dilapidated shed. An officer walked over and opened the door. Inside, they found the bodies of Beryl and her 3-month-old daughter, Geraldine, wrapped in blankets. They had both been strangled to death. The police returned to the jail and told Timothy what they had discovered. Timothy's reaction was strange. It was very muted, almost blank. One of the detectives looked him straight in the eye and asked, "Are you responsible for the deaths of both your wife and your daughter?" Timothy quietly said, "Yes." During the interrogation that followed, Timothy gave a new, detailed confession. He said that he and Beryl had gotten into a huge argument over money. The fight had become physical, and in a fit of rage, he had strangled her to death. Then, 2 days later, he strangled his daughter. After that, he said he hid their bodies in the shed and fled to Wales. Timothy would later take back this final confession, but it didn't matter. A little over a month later, when his case went to trial, the jury didn't believe his retractions. They believed his confession. It didn't take them long to convict him of murder and sentence him to death. Just 3 months after his conviction, on the 9th of March 1950, Timothy Evans found himself in the condemned suite at Pentonville Prison in London. He was sitting at a small table, shackled, with a guard on either side of him. The cell was tiny, and one of its walls was shared with the execution chamber next door. As Timothy sat there, the cell door suddenly flew open. The execution team rushed in. They grabbed Timothy and pulled him to his feet before he had a chance to resist. They pushed him towards a door in that shared wall, the door that led to the execution chamber. When they opened it, Timothy only had a couple of seconds to see what was inside. It was a pale green, square room. A noose dangled from the ceiling directly above a trapdoor in the floor. Off to the side of the room was a large lever. The executioner would pull that lever to open the trapdoor and send the condemned prisoner falling into the pit below. Timothy's heart would have been pounding in his chest. Before he could process it all, he was standing on that trapdoor. The noose was placed over his head and tightened around his neck. A hood was pulled down over his face. The guards all stepped back to the walls. And then, before Timothy could say or do anything, the lever was pulled. He dropped 12 feet down into a brick-lined pit, where he would hang until he died. This gruesome end should have been the final chapter of a very tragic story. But it wasn't. Not even close. 3 years after Timothy's execution, a man named Beresford Brown moved into the same ground-floor apartment that John and Ethel Christie had once lived in. John had moved out just a few days earlier. Beresford found the apartment to be dirty and neglected, so he decided to fix it up. The first thing on his list was to strip all the old wallpaper in the kitchen and put up new paper. He started tearing down the wallpaper, and eventually he made his way into the small kitchen pantry. As he was pulling the paper down in there, one particular strip came off all the way to the floor. And that's when he saw it. Behind the wallpaper, near the bottom of the wall, there was a door. A small, secret door, like the entrance to a crawl space. Beresford was completely intrigued. Why would there be a hidden door in the pantry? He ripped off the rest of the wallpaper covering it, found the handle, and pried it open. What he saw inside that dark, little room would haunt him for the rest of his life. Let's go back 3 years and 4 months, to when Timothy Evans first learned that his wife Beryl was pregnant with their second child. He did go to his friend John Christie for guidance, but that's where the real story departs from what the police and jury believed. When Timothy, in his desperation, told John about the pregnancy, John, who had some medical training from his time in the military, offered a solution. He told Timothy, "I can perform an abortion on Beryl for you." For Timothy, this seemed like a miracle. He was so relieved. He thought all his problems were about to be solved. He rushed upstairs to his apartment and told Beryl the news that John could perform the procedure for them. Beryl agreed. We don't know the exact sequence of events, but the most likely theory is that sometime in November of 1949, Beryl took baby Geraldine and went down to John's apartment on the first floor. When she got there, only John was home. His wife Ethel was out for the day. Timothy was not there for the procedure, but he knew it was happening. Beryl and Geraldine went inside. John likely found a safe place to put Geraldine down in another room. Then, he led Beryl to a chair, a sort of makeshift medical chair he had set up. He told her to sit down. John then brought out a strange device. It looked like a glass jar filled with a clear liquid. 2 thin black hollow tubes came out of the top of the jar and connected to a mouthpiece. John handed the mouthpiece to Beryl and told her to put it over her mouth and breathe in. He explained that it contained a special gas he had made that would numb the pain during the procedure. Beryl, trusting him, did as she was told. She placed the mask over her mouth and nose and started to take deep breaths. As she was breathing, John took a chemical and began to slowly pour it into the glass jar. A thick, white gas started to form inside the jar, above the liquid. The gas was trapped, and as Beryl breathed, she was sucking that gas directly into her lungs. But she didn't feel numb. Instead, she quickly lost consciousness. This was John's plan all along. The device wasn't meant to numb pain, it was designed to knock people out. John Christie had no intention of performing an abortion. He was a serial killer. With Beryl unconscious, John did the same thing he had already done to 2 other women whose bodies were buried in his backyard. He began to assault her. At some point during the attack, Beryl regained consciousness and started to fight back. But John was stronger. He overpowered her and strangled her to death. After she was dead, John simply walked into the other room where little Geraldine was. He took a man's tie, wrapped it around the baby's neck, and strangled her. He then wrapped both mother and daughter in some sheets and hid their bodies in the shed in the backyard. Later, when Timothy came down to see how the procedure went, John told him that there had been a complication and Beryl was dead. He told Timothy not to worry, that he would take care of Geraldine and find a good home for her. He insisted that Timothy needed to leave London immediately and go to Wales. Timothy, likely in a state of shock and trusting his friend, did exactly as he was told. He fled to Wales. But after a little while, he tried to check in on his daughter. He had no idea where she was or who she was with. But John wouldn't let him see her or tell him anything. Overwhelmed with guilt about the whole situation, Timothy finally went to the police. And this is the critical part. When he spoke to the police, he lied. He wanted to protect his friend John, the man he saw as a mentor and father figure. So, he took the blame himself. He said he killed his wife. This is why his first story was so wrong. He had no idea where Beryl's body was, so he just guessed the sewer. That explains why the manhole cover was too heavy for one person to lift, and why the sewer was empty. Then, after the police found the bodies and went back to the jail to tell him, that was the first moment Timothy learned his daughter was also dead. Up until that point, he truly believed John was taking care of her or had given her to another family to raise. So when the detectives told him Geraldine was dead, he was almost certainly in a deep state of shock. His whole family was gone. That explains his muted, blank response. And when they asked him if he was responsible, he said yes, but it's very likely he didn't understand the legal implication of that question. He might have been saying he felt responsible, that his actions led to their deaths, not that he physically killed them. But by the time he snapped out of his shock and tried to tell the police the truth that John Christie was the killer, nobody believed him. His credibility was gone. He had already lied to them. And when the police looked into his background, they learned he was a known compulsive liar. Making everything worse was the fact that Timothy had a clear and obvious motive. He was in crippling debt, and his relationship with his wife was violent and toxic, with plenty of witnesses to their fights. During Timothy's trial, he and his lawyers did everything they could to point the finger at John Christie. But it was useless. John Christie took the witness stand and was the perfect witness for the prosecution. He was a war hero, a former police officer, well-spoken, intelligent, and respected. The jury believed every word he said. In contrast, Timothy was the opposite. He was illiterate, unintelligent, and a proven liar. In the end, it was the testimony of the real killer, John Christie, that sent the innocent man, Timothy Evans, to his death. The police also completely botched the investigation from the very beginning. They went into it absolutely convinced that Timothy was guilty. To them, it was an open and shut case. Because they were so focused on proving Timothy's guilt, they were blind to the obvious evidence all around them. For example, during their search of the property, a neighborhood dog actually dug up one of the skeletons of the other women John had killed and buried in the garden. A human skull and a leg bone were lying out in the open while police were walking around. John was able to quickly grab the skull and throw it into a neighboring burned-out building, but the leg bone was left leaning against the backyard fence in plain sight. Nobody noticed it. The police are also believed to have coerced Timothy into signing his final confession. There's even speculation that they forged his signature on the document. So, Timothy Evans was executed, and the real killer, John Christie, was free to keep killing. He would go on to murder at least 4 more women, including his own wife, Ethel, using the same method, the gas machine, followed by assault and strangulation. It was during this time that he stuffed his wife's body under the floorboards of their front room, and he crammed the bodies of 3 other victims into that tiny secret room in the pantry. He did this so that the smell of decomposition would always be present in his apartment. After Beresford Brown found those 3 bodies in the pantry and called the police, a massive manhunt for John Christie began. 10 days later, on the 31st of March, 1953, he was found and arrested. He eventually confessed to killing all 8 victims. The police only had enough evidence to charge him with the murder of his wife Ethel, but that was enough. He was found guilty, and he received a death sentence. On July 15th of that year, John Christie was sitting in the very same condemned suite at Pentonville Prison where Timothy Evans had sat 3.5 years earlier. The door opened, and the same execution team that had executed Timothy came in. They grabbed John, hoisted him up, and moved him towards the execution chamber. They rushed him onto the trap door, put the noose around his neck, and pulled the hood over his head. Just as the executioner was about to pull the lever, John suddenly said, "My nose itches." The executioner simply replied, "It won't bother you for long," and pulled the switch. The case of Timothy Evans and John Christie caused a massive public outcry. The fact that an obviously innocent man had been executed by the state was a profound injustice that shook the nation. This case was a major factor that led the United Kingdom to suspend the death penalty in 1965 and then to abolish it completely in 1969. And in 1966, between those 2 dates, Timothy Evans received a posthumous royal pardon for the murder of his family. His name was officially cleared, and he was declared an innocent man. Thank you so much for watching. Timothy Evans was poor, uneducated, frightened, and deeply flawed. But being flawed doesn't make someone guilty. And in one of the greatest miscarriages of justice in British history, that distinction came far too late. If you enjoyed today's episode, there's a full playlist of true crime stories waiting for you right now. Until next time, take care. See ya.
In 1918, the world was deep in the trenches of the First World War. A British soldier named Henry Tandy was stationed in northern France, hunkered down in one of those muddy, grim trenches. By this point in the war, Henry was already a hero. He was a decorated soldier, and he would eventually go on to become the most decorated British private of the entire war. But all of his medals and all of his awards are not what he's really remembered for. What he's remembered for happened on a single day, September 28th of that year. It had been a long, brutal day of fighting. As dusk settled, Henry was propped up on the edge of his trench, just scanning the desolate landscape in front of him. He was looking out towards the German line. It was getting dark, the air was quiet for once, and a light mist was starting to roll in, clinging to the ground. And at some point, through that mist, Henry saw a figure. It was way off in the distance, just a silhouette, and it was walking directly towards him. Instinct took over immediately. Henry raised his rifle to his shoulder, his eye finding the sight. But he didn't pull the trigger. He held his breath. He had to be sure who he was looking at. In the confusion of the battlefield, it could easily be one of their own men, maybe wounded and disoriented, trying to make his way back to the safety of the trench. Firing on a friendly was a soldier's worst nightmare. So Henry just stayed there, perfectly still, his rifle aimed, waiting for the figure to get closer, to emerge from the shifting fog. After a few tense seconds, the shape became clearer. A man walked out of the mist. He was a German soldier. So, it was the enemy. But something was off. The man was badly wounded. He was stumbling, not marching. He wasn't carrying a weapon, and he didn't seem to have any idea that he was walking straight into the sights of an enemy rifle. He just kept plodding forward, lost in his own world of pain and exhaustion. Henry centered the rifle's sight right on the German soldier's heart. It was an easy shot, but he hesitated. His finger hovered over the trigger, but he couldn't bring himself to squeeze it. The man just kept walking, getting closer and closer until he was only about 30 meters away. And at that point, he stopped. He looked up, and his eyes met Henry's. And in that instant, the German soldier realized his mistake. He understood he was about to die. But instead of panicking, instead of trying to run or dive for cover, he just stood there. He stared right at Henry with a look of resignation, as if he was simply accepting his fate. Now, Henry Tandy had shot many men during the war. It was part of the job. It was what you had to do to survive. But this was different. He just could not bring himself to shoot this unarmed, wounded man who just looked so pathetic and defeated. So, with his rifle still raised, Henry quickly glanced to his left and then to his right. He was checking to make sure none of his comrades were watching, that no one was going to see what he was about to do. The coast was clear. And so, Henry slowly, deliberately lowered his gun. For a long moment, the two men just stared at each other across that small patch of no man's land. An enemy soldier who should be dead, and the man who should have killed him. Finally, the German soldier gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. It was a nod of thanks. Then he turned around and just wandered back the way he came, disappearing once again into the mist. The man whose life Henry had just spared was Adolf Hitler. In the early morning hours of the 10th of June, 1994, a woman named Deborah Hoyt suddenly woke up in the middle of the night. She and her husband were staying with relatives in Sacramento, California. They had planned to be there for a few more days, enjoying their visit. But as Deborah sat up in bed in the dark, she was hit with this sudden, overwhelming urge. She felt like she needed to leave right then and there and head back to their home in Lake Tahoe. She had no idea where this feeling was coming from. It wasn't a thought, it was a physical sensation, a deep sense of urgency that she couldn't explain. She didn't know what to make of it, so she shook her husband awake. She tried to explain the feeling to him, this strange dread, this feeling that something was wrong, and they had to go home immediately. Her husband, still half asleep, listened patiently. He told her, you know what? You probably just had a bad dream. You're still kind of waking up, half in your dream. It's not a big deal. Just try to go back to bed. Everything is totally fine. He said if she still felt that way in the morning, they could leave then. He would be happy to go. And so Deborah thought, yeah, he's probably right. I'm totally overreacting. It must have just been a nightmare. She laid back down and closed her eyes, trying to force herself to go back to sleep. But as she laid there in the quiet room, that sense of dread didn't go away. In fact, it just grew stronger and stronger. The feeling that something was terribly wrong and that she had to leave right now was becoming unbearable. It was like an alarm was going off inside her head. Finally, she couldn't take it anymore. She jumped out of the bed and stood there in the dark. She said to her husband, "Honey, we have to go. Right now. I don't know what's wrong, but we have to go." Her husband really did not want to get up and drive in the middle of the night. He tried to reason with her again. He said, "Come on, Deborah, get back in bed. It's not a big deal." But she was adamant. She wasn't asking any more. She was telling him, "Get out of bed. We are leaving right now." Seeing how serious and genuinely distressed she was, her husband begrudgingly gave in. He said, okay, we'll leave right now. So the two of them hastily packed up their things, trying to be as quiet as possible. They went downstairs and left a quick note for their relatives, trying to explain their sudden departure. Then they got in their car, pulled out of the driveway, and drove off into the night. After a little while, the couple reached a very dangerous section of their journey home. It was a stretch of road called Ballen Bend. It was a winding, treacherous road carved into the side of the mountains. There were sharp turns and steep drop-offs. One wrong move, one moment of lost concentration, and you and your car would go flying down the side of a mountain. They were driving through this area for about 15 minutes, the headlights cutting through the darkness when they came around a particularly sharp turn. As soon as they made the turn and could see the stretch of road ahead, Deborah, who was in the passenger seat, saw something. Up ahead, on the right side of the road, several feet off the pavement, there was a shape just lying there on the shoulder. At first, she couldn't make it out. She thought maybe it was a large bag of trash that had fallen off a truck, or maybe a dead animal like a deer. Her first instinct was to just dismiss it, to not think about it. But as her husband drove closer and closer, the car's headlights began to illuminate it more clearly. She squinted, trying to discern what it was, but it was just a strange lump. It wasn't until they were right next to it and she looked out her window that she realized what she was seeing. It was a woman's body. A woman with no clothes on, just lying there on the dirt, completely motionless. Deborah gasped and immediately turned to her husband. She screamed, "Honey, I just saw a dead woman on the side of the road." Her husband, hearing the panic in her voice, was instantly on high alert. He didn't slow down, he just kept driving, his mind racing. He said, "Should we stop? Should we turn around? I mean, maybe she's not dead. Maybe we can help her." But Deborah, at this point, was absolutely terrified. She was shaking. She said, "No. Keep going. Don't go back. I bet it's a trap. Someone probably put her there to lure people in. They're going to attack us if we try to stop and help." In that chaotic, frenzied moment with adrenaline pumping, they had to make a decision. They decided their best and safest course of action was to just keep driving until they could find a payphone and call the police. And as it happened, less than a quarter of a mile down the road, there was a ranger station with a phone outside. They pulled into the parking lot, and Deborah jumped out and called the police, her hands trembling as she dialed. The dispatcher told her to wait inside her car with the doors locked, and that officers would be there in a couple of minutes. They said they would need her to lead them back to where she saw the body. A few minutes later, a police car pulled up. Deborah and her husband explained what they saw. The officers told them to drive back up the road, but to stop about 200 yards short of where they thought the body was. So, Deborah and her husband got back in their car and drove back up the winding road they had just come down. They reached the point just before that very sharp turn. Deborah knew that right on the other side of that bend was where the body would be. They pulled over on the side of the road as instructed. The police pulled up alongside them. Deborah told them, "Yep, right around that corner, you're going to find her lying on the ground on the left side." So Deborah and her husband just sat there in their car, watching as the two officers got out and walked up the road. They saw them make the turn and disappear out of sight. A moment later, they could see the beams of the officers' flashlights moving around on the other side of the bend, sweeping across the dark mountainside. They figured, okay, they're looking for the body now. They must have found her. But after several long minutes, the officers walked back down the road toward their car. One of them tapped on Deborah's window. He said, "You know what, guys? We didn't see anything up there. There wasn't a body. There wasn't anything out of the ordinary at all." Deborah was stunned. She insisted, "I'm not lying. I know what I saw. It was a woman's body, right there. I know it was. It's right over there." The officers were calm. They told her that they believed she saw something, but they couldn't do anything because there was simply nothing there now. They suggested she and her husband just head home and try to get some rest. And so, confused and shaken, that's what they did. After Deborah and her husband took off, the two responding officers drove back to their station. Once they were inside, they started talking about the strange call. They were speculating about what Deborah might have seen. Maybe it was a mannequin or a trick of the light. As they were talking, another officer came into the station, a guy by the name of Rich Strasser. He overheard their conversation and was intrigued. He walked over and asked them what had happened. They explained the whole story to him about the woman named Deborah who called in a dead woman's body up on Ballen Bend. As soon as Rich heard the words Ballen Bend, something clicked in his memory. He remembered that just a couple of days ago, the station had received a missing person report. It was for a young woman named Christine Skubish and her young son, Nick. They had gone missing, and the last place they had been seen was up on Ballen Bend. Rich started to wonder if maybe there was a connection. Maybe there really was a body up there, and maybe it was Christine's. So, the next morning, Rich got up early and headed out to Ballen Bend by himself. He drove up the mountain road to the exact spot where Deborah had claimed to have seen the body. He parked his car and got out. As he was scanning the area, his eyes landed on something small on the shoulder of the road. It was a children's shoe. He walked over and picked it up. He looked around for anything else that might be out of the ordinary, but there was nothing. No skid marks on the road, no other debris, no other clothes, nothing to indicate an accident. So Rich walked over to the guardrail that overlooked a very steep, densely wooded embankment. He peered over the edge, looking down the side of the mountain. At first, all he could see was a thick canopy of trees and brush. But as he kept looking, scanning back and forth, he thought he saw a flash of color farther down the mountain. It looked like more clothing, snagged on a branch. So, he made a decision. He climbed over the guardrail and very carefully started to make his way down the steep, unstable slope. After just a few seconds of climbing down, he reached a small clearing in the branches. And from there, he could see down to where the terrain leveled off a bit. And right down there, half hidden by the trees, was a smashed-up red four-door sedan. It was the same type of car that Christine Skubish had been driving when she and her son went missing. Rich scrambled the rest of the way down the mountain, following a trail of debris that led all the way to the wrecked car. He went around to the driver's side and looked inside. And there, in the driver's seat, was Christine Skubish. She was deceased. Then he looked over to the passenger seat. There was her son, Nicky, and he was alive. But just barely. He was severely dehydrated and weak. He had gone 5 days without any food or water. Doctors would later say that when Rich found him, Nicky probably only had about 1, maybe 2 hours left before he would have died as well. Authorities believe that Christine had probably fallen asleep at the wheel and her car had drifted off the road and plunged down that embankment. Initially, Rich and the other officers believed that Deborah must have seen Christine. The theory was that after the accident, Christine must have somehow survived the initial crash, gotten out of her car, and managed to climb all the way back up that steep embankment. Then she would have laid on the road, hoping someone would see her and stop to help. And then, when no one stopped, she must have gone back down to her car, where she ultimately died. But according to the coroner's report, that would have been completely impossible. The coroner determined that when Christine's car crashed, she died on impact. She had been dead for 5 days before Deborah drove by and saw that woman on the side of the road. So it could not have been Christine. To this day, no one knows for sure who or what Deborah saw on the side of that road. But it is an objective, undeniable fact that Officer Rich Strasser only went back to investigate Bullion Bend and only found Nicky alive because of Deborah's police report about seeing a dead woman. And Deborah was only on that road in the first place because she had this totally bizarre, unexplainable, middle-of-the-night urge to suddenly leave her relative's house and drive up into the mountains. It was something she had never felt before and still doesn't know how to explain. So either this is one of the most extremely strange sets of coincidences in history, or little Nicky had a guardian angel looking out for him that night. In early 1983, residents of the Cranley Gardens apartment complex in North London started to complain about their drains. They were clogged up and water was backing up into their flats. Initially, their landlord was pretty dismissive. He told them, "Oh, it's just an old building. It's old plumbing, that's why it's slow." But the complaints kept coming, and eventually the landlord conceded and said he would call a plumber to come out and have a look. So, on the evening of February 8th, an experienced plumber named Mike showed up at Cranley Gardens. After hearing what the complaints were, he went around to the side of the building and located a main drain cover. He opened it up to have a look inside. Just as he expected, when he shined his flashlight down into the pipe, he saw big wads of hair and napkins and all sorts of other gunk mashed together, clogging up the works. So he reached in with his gloved hands and started pulling the stuff out, tossing it into a bucket next to him. After he had cleared out the majority of the obstruction, he reached his arm all the way into the pipe to feel around just to make sure he got everything, that there wasn't anything else in there that he couldn't see. At some point, as he was reaching deeper, when his arm was almost completely inside this pipe, his hand hit a major blockage. It was solid. He moved his fingers around, trying to feel what it was, but he couldn't tell. It was something that felt fairly soft, kind of fleshy, but there were some hard things inside of it, like little sticks or rods. So he grabbed a handful of this blockage and he pulled his arm back out of the pipe. He opened his hand to see what he was holding. It looked like ground meat, but it wasn't any kind of meat he had ever seen before. And mixed into this fleshy substance were what looked like little bits of bone. Now, Mike had cleared a lot of pipes in his career, and he had never, ever seen meat be the reason for a blockage. The whole situation just seemed really strange to him. He decided, you know what, it's getting late. I'll just come back tomorrow with my supervisor. He can see what this is too. So Mike put the cap back on the drain pipe and walked out from behind the building, heading back towards his truck, which was parked on the road. As he was walking, 2 of the residents from the complex came out. They saw him and asked, "Hey, did you fix the blockage?" What was it? And Mike said, no, he hadn't fixed it yet. And then he just kind of blurted out that there was meat in the pipes. That's what was causing the blockage. And then one of these 2 residents, a man, casually says, "Well, I bet people are just flushing their Kentucky Fried Chicken down the drains. That's what's causing it." Mike just looked at him and was like, "Yeah, maybe." Then he turned around, got in his truck, and drove away. Early the next morning, Mike and his supervisor came back to Cranley Gardens. They went around to the side of the building, they took the cap off the drain, and then Mike reached down inside, expecting to feel that same strange, meaty blockage. But where it should have been, there was nothing. The pipe was clear. Somebody had come and cleared it out overnight. Mike and his supervisor are looking at each other, and Mike is like, there's no way that cleared on its own. Someone had to have come out here and done it. He couldn't understand why someone would do that, but still have them come back out. But the men decide, you know what? Maybe by some slim chance, it did just slip through and clear itself. So they decided to just continue the process and make sure each apartment building's individual pipe was unobstructed. They started checking the pipes one by one, and they found that all of them were clear, except for one. The pipe coming from apartment number 23 was completely blocked up with more of that same meaty substance. Now, Mike and his partner were already very suspicious. The fact that someone had probably snuck out in the middle of the night and cleared the main pipe was a huge red flag. And now they're finding more of this weird fleshy stuff, and it's coming from one specific apartment. The whole situation just felt wrong. So they told the landlord that they were not going to touch it. Somebody else had to come out and deal with this. The landlord, after finding out there was what looked like meat jammed in his pipes, got really freaked out and he called the police. The police showed up, they pulled the meaty substance out of the pipes, and they sent it to a mortuary for analysis. A pathologist looked at it and confirmed their worst fears. This was meat, all right? It was human meat. And in particular, the stuff that was pulled out of the pipe from apartment number 23 was identified as being from a human neck. So the police go back to Cranley Gardens. They go up to apartment number 23 and they knock on the door. When the door opens, they're hit with this overwhelming stench of rotting flesh. It was nauseating. And standing in the doorway of this apartment is a guy in his late 30s or early 40s who introduces himself as Dennis Nilsson. The police say, "Hey, Dennis, can we have a look around your apartment?" And he says, "Why? What's this about?" They tell him, "Well, we found human remains in your pipes." And Dennis immediately puts on a show of shock and horror. He says, "Oh my goodness, I can't believe that. That's horrible." But the police are not buying it for a second. One of the officers looks him straight in the eye and says, "You know what, Dennis? Tell us where the rest of the body is." And at this, Dennis's whole demeanor changed. His face suddenly went blank, expressionless. All the emotion just drained away. He just turns around, points into his bedroom, and says in a flat voice, "It's in 2 plastic bags in my closet." Before the police go into his apartment to inspect the bags, they ask him, "Dennis, are there any other bodies in your apartment that we should know about?" Dennis sighs, and he looks up at the ceiling for a moment as if he's counting. And then he says, "Yeah, there's about 15 or 16 here." It's a long story. It goes way back. I'd love to tell it to you, get this off my chest. And I'll do it at the police station. After Dennis was arrested and brought to the station, he told them his entire horrible story. It had all started 5 years earlier in 1978 when Dennis was 33 years old. He was at a pub having some drinks by himself when a teenager came into the bar and tried to buy an alcoholic drink. He was denied service because he was underage. So Dennis saw an opportunity. He pulled the young man aside and said, "Hey, I'd be happy to give you a drink at my apartment. It's just right down the road." The young man, whose name was Steven, was excited about this and said, "Great, let's go." Once they got back to Dennis's apartment, the two of them had lots of drinks. They were having fun, laughing, and at some point they climbed into bed together. The next morning, when Dennis got up, his new friend Steven was still sleeping right next to him. And as Dennis looked at him, he was filled with this sudden, overwhelming sense of dread. Because he knew that as soon as Steven woke up, he would see this as just a one-night stand. He would get dressed, and he would leave. He wouldn't stick around and remain friends with Dennis. And Dennis just could not stand that idea. He wanted Steven to stay. He looked on the ground next to the bed and saw the necktie that Stephen had been wearing. It was just lying there in a heap. He got on the ground, he grabbed the necktie, and he fashioned it into a noose. Then he climbed back on the bed, got on top of Stephen's chest, and he looped the tie around his neck. Then he pulled it as tight as he could. Dennis would tell police that as soon as the tie tightened, Stephen came alive. He started thrashing, reaching for his neck, trying to pull the tie off, kicking Dennis as hard as he could, but he just couldn't get it off. And at some point, Dennis said, Stephen just seemed to give up. He looked up at Dennis, and he knew he wasn't going to win this fight, that Dennis was determined to kill him. And so Stephen just allowed himself to go limp. Dennis said he relaxed the pressure a little bit, but as he's looking at Stephen, he realized he wasn't dead. He was just unconscious. So Dennis goes into his kitchen and he gets this huge plastic bucket. He fills it up with water and sets it in the middle of his kitchen floor. Then he gets a bunch of kitchen chairs and he lines them up like he's making a makeshift table right in front of this bucket of water. Then he drags Stephen's unconscious body into the kitchen and he lays him on his back across these chairs. But he makes sure his head is not resting on a chair, his head is kind of dangling off the back. Then he grabbed that bucket of water and he slid it right underneath Stephen's dangling head. Then Dennis got on top of the chairs on top of Stephen and he pressed the young man's face straight down, bending his head backwards until his mouth and his nose were under the water. Dennis held him like that. Stephen regained consciousness for a moment, submerged in the water, but again, he didn't fight it. He knew he was doomed. After several minutes, the bubbles stopped coming to the surface, and Stephen was dead. Dennis pulled his victim's body off of the chairs. He brought him into the living room, and he sat him up on a chair. Then Dennis went into the kitchen, and he made himself a cup of coffee and smoked a few cigarettes. And he just stood in the doorway and looked at Stephen's body sitting there in the chair. He would tell police it was a very bizarre experience because Stephen still looked like he was alive. In fact, Dennis started talking to him as if he expected him to talk back. But obviously, he didn't. At some point, Dennis realized that the life he had before he killed Stephen was now over. He had a new life now, and he didn't really know how to handle it. The first thing he thought to do was to clean Stephen. So he took Stephen's body and brought him into the bathroom, and he gave him a very long bath. He cleaned his body, he washed his hair, and afterwards he got him out, he dried him off, dressed him, and put him into his own bed. And then Dennis climbed into bed with him and just laid there. He would tell police that as he laid there, he suddenly felt overjoyed. Stephen was not going to leave him. He was going to stay here for as long as Dennis wanted him to. After laying with the body for some time, Dennis realized he had to find a way to hide Stephen's body in his apartment so no one could find him. He left his apartment and went to a hardware store where he bought an electric knife and a big storage bin. He brought them back to his apartment, and as he was about to start cutting Stephen up, he just couldn't go through with it. So instead, he just climbed back into bed and took a nap next to Stephen's body. When he got up again, he moved Stephen's body onto the ground in his living room and covered him with a blanket. Then he went and made dinner, sat in his chair right next to the body on the ground, and watched television for a while. When he was done watching TV, he looked at the body on the floor and realized he really hadn't made any progress in terms of hiding him. And that's when he remembered that he had a loose floorboard in his apartment. He went over to the loose floorboard, he pulled it up, and he saw there was a crawl space under the floors. So he pulled a couple more boards up, and then he grabbed Stephen's body and attempted to force him down into the space. But by now, Stephen's body had begun to stiffen up from rigor mortis. Specifically, his arms were outstretched over his head in a kind of Y shape. So as Dennis was trying to force him down into the narrow space, his rigid arms were getting in the way. So Dennis took Stephen's body and he propped him up against the wall in his bedroom. The body was just standing there, rigid against the wall, with its arms stuck up over its head and its eyes still open. And then, after doing that, Dennis just got into his bed and fell asleep. So, all night long, this corpse is essentially staring at Dennis from across the room. The next morning, when Dennis got up, there was Stephen, still propped against the wall, hands in the air, looking down at him. Dennis grabbed Stephen's body, put it on the ground, and began yanking and jerking and pulling on each of Stephen's arms until he finally broke the rigor mortis and could pin them down by his side. Then he started working on his legs and his hips, contorting the body until it was small enough that he could pack him down under the floor. Once he was under there, Dennis just put the boards back on top and went about his daily life. For the next couple of days, he totally forgot about Stephen. But about a week after putting him under the floor, Dennis decided he missed Stephen and he wanted to see him again. So one night, he opened up the floorboards, he looked down, and there was Stephen. Dennis would say it looked like he was dirty. So he pulled him out of the floor and he gave him another bath. After he had cleaned Stephen's body, he pulled him out of the water, dried him off, and put him back in the chair. And then Dennis took a bath himself in the same water he had just used to clean the corpse. After a long soak, Dennis finally got out, toweled himself off, he redressed Stephen, and then he forced him back under the floorboards and covered him up again. The body would remain there for the next 7 months. Finally, Dennis decided to dispose of him by burning him in a bonfire outside of the apartment building. After the body was completely incinerated and gone, Dennis remembered thinking to himself, "I can't believe I just got away with murder." And so, he would do it again. And again, and again. He killed at least 15 young men from North London, all by strangulation, or by drowning, or a combination of the two. And after he killed them, he would keep them stashed in his apartment for months at a time. In his closet, in his cabinets, in his bed, under the floors. His small apartment was filled with these bodies. And while they were in his apartment, he liked to periodically take them out to spend time with them. He told police he found corpses to be beautiful. He was fascinated by them. But eventually, in 1983, he had so many bodies stashed all over his apartment that he knew he really needed to expedite getting rid of them. And so he began cutting them up into smaller pieces and trying to force them down his toilet and his drain, which eventually clogged the pipes for the whole building. And so when Mike, the plumber, showed up and discovered the me substance, Dennis overheard him talking about it. That night, after Mike was gone, Dennis had gone outside and attempted to clear the rest of the human remains from the main pipes, but he wasn't aware that there were still remains stuck in the specific pipe that led directly to his apartment. Dennis Nilsen confessed to killing 15 young men and attempting to kill at least 7 others. He was sentenced to life in prison. Dennis never showed any remorse, nor did he ever show any desire to want to be free again. He actually said that he deserved to be in jail for what he did. In 2018, Dennis Nilsen would die in prison at the age of 72. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya.